gone by those two T-80 tanks, which have opened fire from the front of the White House building.
That 9:52 a.m. Moscow time, we remind you, translates to about 2:52 a.m. in New York, Washington, or Atlanta. Our coverage of events in Moscow and elsewhere continues after this.
Fiera Milano. Contact 60 million people, 1 million companies at the Milan Fair. You can. The Milan Fair, Italy's most important, the world's most complete. Fiera Milano, and you're on the world market. Fiera Milano.
Business Asia, I think the name says it all. Our focus is on Asian trade, Asian financial markets, the regional economy, and the impact on the entire global economy.
Business Asia with Bill Hartley on CNN International.
If you can't be there for all the excitement of global sports competition, on the field and around the track, stay on top of the action, the scores and the highlights with CNN International every hour round the clock. And remember, CNN International brings you live coverage of breaking news from around the world.
The Iraqi president appears determined.
Live updates from Europe and the global hotspots.
The residents of Sarajevo forced to dodge snipers.
News features on lifestyles worldwide. International business programs. Plus live reports from the world's financial capitals. In-depth global weather. And interviews with entertainers and experts on international issues.
I get asked in lots of interviews, who are you prepared not to like?
For sports, news, business, and weather, turn to the one source seen in over 200 countries and territories. CNN International, the world's news leader.
There have been signs over the past half hour or so of a possible denouement to the crisis in Moscow. Let's go live to correspondent Claire Shipman, who's there. Claire.
Bob, well, we've had more word from Yeltsin's military advisor, Dmitry Volkogonov, again through the Reuters news agency. He said that altogether there have been about 700 military men involved in this, 10 tanks, some other APCs. He said that, in fact, when the special troops entered the White House, if the people inside immediately put their hands up and dropped their guns and surrendered, they were not hurt. But again, that figure is still being quoted of at least 500 inside dead. Volkogonov also said there can be no guarantees for those who started this bloodshed, and by that he probably means Mr. Rutskoy and Mr. Hozbalatov. And what you may be able to see now from one of our cameras are pictures outside of the White House. Troops are gathering among the demonstrators there. The demonstrators have been trying to push back and forth from the front of the White House. They seem to have pushed their way in. Again, they're not all demonstrators. Many of them have just come as onlookers trying to get in closer. The troops have not been able to keep them back. And as the gunfire goes off, as you hear the sniper fire, they've been rushing back one way or the other. There's no way to tell if people are being crushed or hurt in that crowd at all. What we're seeing now is a picture from the back of the White House, some tanks and APCs still there at the back of the White House. But again, no movement. It appears there may be some sort of negotiating underway. Bob?
Claire Shipman in Moscow, and we will continue our coverage with, most immediately, a business news update after this.
Advertising.
It would be unclear as to from which direction the shots initially started. You could see puffs of smoke. That would be from the back of the Russian White House. That's entrance 20 back there. That's the entrance that the government had told people if they wanted to come out, they should surrender from entrance 20 below that balcony. But as the day progressed, as the morning progressed, a lot of anti-Yeltsin demonstrators who had congregated on the Arbat Street about a mile north of here had converged down towards the White House and overran a barricade of trucks trying to get back into the White House. They occasionally have been fired upon. It's not sure if they've been fired upon by their own men, perhaps confusing them for government forces.
Again, it would seem that perhaps this was in response to some firing from the White House. The people downstairs in our control room tell us that there was firing coming from within the White House, so this may be a government response to that.
Yes, you could see the flashes from the guns inside the White House earlier along that side, above entrance 20 and to the side.
In either event, it would appear that this sense of budding optimism that this might be winding down was a little premature.
Yes, it could be. Mr. Grotchov did meet with some of the troops on top of the tanks along Kutuzovsky Prospect, but he sped away in his car. He did not have anyone from inside the Congress with him.
There are still Special Forces troops inside the building working their way up. Are there, as far as you know, Eileen?
Yes, there are. The government had, in fact, stopped firing upon the building for a while. There you see some flashes from inside the building. Now, those are the upper floors of the White House. That would be areas that probably those special forces have not gotten to yet. We had been told that they had taken the first 5 floors of the building. Now, within that building, that part of the building, it's a maze of long, winding corridors. They go around and the edges of the building, around circular areas. There's stairwells on either side of that building. Those stairwells are literally in kind of enclosed shafts and covered, surrounded by glass. Anyone coming up those stairwells would be from a clear shot from doorways within the stairwells. And the defenders of the White House had barricaded themselves within the doorways of stairwells with some iron safes and heavy barricades that from behind which they could shoot out at government troops coming up the steps. So there would probably be heavy casualties on the government side in any attempt to storm that building.
It would appear we are going to have to assume that this will not be over until every single dissident has been removed and disarmed. There appear to be different factions there.
Exactly, and it would seem that some of the deputies have decided they'd had enough, but others who had told us all along inside of the building that they absolutely were not going to give up. They intended to fight to the death. Vice President Alexander Rutskoy said that himself, so this figure of casualties in the hundreds may not be really an exaggeration.
Claire, can you elaborate on the people that are on the steps of the building right there now? Are they the Parliament supporters?
Well, some of them are the Parliament supporters. We're also told that a lot of the people around that building were simply people who were trying to get a better look at the action. The people who are right there on the steps are probably only the Parliament supporters because most of the others have been kept back by the troops. There were some Parliament supporters there overnight. Many of them remained. They were there before the troops came in. So unless these were the onlookers who were able to push through, it's most likely they're the supporters.
There you can see a tank next to that's on the approach to the White House. That's an APC, very close to the White House. Its engines going. A lot of the APCs in the front of the White House, they were joined by a couple of tanks. They did fire upon the front of the White House earlier this morning, causing a very severe fire that has blackened the white marble of the front of the White House. The other thing is, Claire can attest to as well, that a lot of these demonstrators were from various groups. They did not necessarily completely back Mr. Rutskoy or Mr. Hasbulatov. We often encountered pushing and shoving matches among the defenders of the White House over their support for Mr. Rutskoy or Mr. Hasbulatov. All they were united in was that they were against Mr. Yeltsin.
Exactly. They were from both ends of the spectrum. There were the people from fascist parties, people from communist parties, monarchists, really people who exactly had nothing in common except their hatred for the government.
Some of the toughest defenders of the White House that we saw inside had a decorated swastika on their fatigues. They were of a nationalist party, a fascist party. They were very tough. They were women and men, many of them veterans, nationalists, very pro-Russian, pro-white Russian.
The Yeltsin administration, Claire and Eileen, still wants this wrapped up by dusk, we understand. Are you seeing any additional troop or military vehicle movements around you there now?
No, there haven't been any additional troop movements, and Mr. Volkogonov, Yeltsin's military advisor, was very specific about the number. He said, in fact, there were only 10 tanks involved in the operation, 700 elite military forces, and a number of APCs and other armored personnel carriers. And we have seen no additional movement.
There was a report on one of the wire services that some personnel carriers, just troop trucks, had come along the Naberezhnaya filled with troops, about 40 trucks, but they were coming from the outside of the city along the Frunzenskaya, which is along the Moscow River. We're not sure where those troops are. We have not seen them advance any closer. We have not seen any convoy of that size coming into the White House.
Well, once again, does either of you have any idea what triggered this outburst after quite a lengthy period of a lull?
Well, certainly, it may well have been that there were a lot of people that had been coming down from the new Arbat Street down around the White House, and were getting very, very close to the White House, up against it. And also, it did appear that there was some firing coming from within the White House out, and that may well have triggered some of this.
I think probably they were, those special forces that are inside are working their way up, as Eileen was describing, through that maze of corridors, trying to clear it out floor by floor, and as they're reaching the upper floors where some of the people, the armed people inside, may have retreated, the firing is going on, and probably from the outside they're just getting support for their battle inside.
As you can see right now, those tanks on the bridge are moving forward. Some of the special Oman troops have moved up the front steps of the White House to push some of those people that we saw earlier on the steps of the White House back. There does appear to be movement in this siege of the White House.
All right, Eileen and Claire, if you'll please stand by. Thank you both. We're going to take a brief break now, and CNN's continuous live coverage of events in Moscow and other news will resume in just a couple of minutes. I'm Bob Kane.
This is CNN International.
Jetzt gibt es Miracle Blade 2, ein computerdesigntes Präzisionsmesser aus chirurgischem Stahl. Ein Messer, mit dem Sie einfach alles schneiden können. Achten Sie einmal auf unser Angebot.
Leading up to today's assault, anti-Yeltsin protesters forced 3 television stations off the air. Government troops battle back.
Hello, I'm Donna Kelly.
I'm Leon Harris.
Russia's political crisis is down to this: tanks and gunfire. The latest rounds came about 10 minutes ago between government forces outside the Russian White House and defiant lawmakers inside. Hours after an ultimatum from President Boris Yeltsin that those who do not surrender face capture by military forces, Reuters news agency quotes a military aide to President Yeltsin as saying some 500 people are dead inside Russia's White House. CNN has no independent confirmation of that report. Just over an hour ago, 3 men carrying white flags left the Parliament building and joined a crowd of about 1,000 anti-Yeltsin demonstrators outside. Representatives of the hardline deputies reportedly are holding negotiations with the Russian defense minister outside the building. Mr. Yeltsin ordered tanks to fire on the Parliament building to force opposition lawmakers out. But those inside refuse to budge. Opposition leader Vice President Alexander Rutskoy has said he will negotiate but not surrender. In a taped television address, Mr. Yeltsin denounced his opponents as criminals for unleashing what he called a bloody massacre. He said he had hoped that the two sides could reach an agreement and preserve peace in the capital. Today's attack follows a weekend of violence in which hardline protesters hurled rocks and fired guns at riot police. At least 20 civilians were killed and more than 100 others injured. Lawmakers barricaded themselves inside the Parliament building on September 21st after Mr. Yeltsin disbanded Parliament and called new elections. Right now, let's go ahead and take you live to Moscow, and we'll get the latest on the situation right there. We're going to take a live picture.
On the roof of the CNN building. We're just seeing a tank fire from Kutuzovsky Bridge. Here goes one against the upper floors. Let's listen. That is against the upper floors of the White House. Now, those tanks are on Kutuzovsky Bridge, right down from the CNN bureau. 2 T-80 tanks fired upon the front of the Russian White House. That was where we had seen earlier, just a few moments ago, shots coming from near those windows upon which those tanks fired. Shots from, clearly coming from within the White House against government forces outside. Here you can see the tanks that did the firing just then.
Elaine?
We saw Pavel Grachev on that bridge just about half an hour ago. He is Mr. Yeltsin's defense minister. I was down there on the bridge. I did not see any of the members of the Congress down there with him. He was just speaking to troops. There was a man who looked much like Mr. Rutskoy with him, but it was not Mr. Rutskoy, although some reporters were thinking that it was.
Eileen, in that shot that we just saw at the Russian White House, is that the first time it's been hit in this latest round, or was there something that we missed before we got to the live picture?
There was one shot before you got to the live pictures which you missed, which was a direct hit on the building, as was that. You can see severe damage to the upper floors. According to government reports, military reports, the lower floors had been taken by those elite troops of Mr. Yeltsin's, by some of the paratroopers. So it would appear that the defenders of the White House would be going upwards towards the roof.
Eileen, we've been hearing some numbers about those who may be dead inside the White House and those who may be wounded. Can you get any confirmation or have any later numbers for us?
Here's the back of the Russian White House. You can see smoke billowing out. Inside the Russian White House, we couldn't confirm the numbers from within. There was more than 100 deputies, and there were, last week, at the end of the last few days, maybe a couple hundred defenders of the White House left. But yesterday, when anti-Yeltsin demonstrators overran the barricades around the White House, their numbers swelled, and it's not clear how many would be inside the building. What would your estimate be, Claire?
This is Claire Shipman with Eileen. It seemed that the last time we were in there yesterday, there were at least 200, 250 people inside of the building, but again, many of them may have gone inside in the middle of the night, the Parliament demonstrators, and they may have been among some of the casualties inside of the building.
I believe that we have some pictures of the casualties, do we?
We did have some pictures earlier of men with white flags coming out of the building and carrying, obviously wounded, on the stretcher that is coming out of the front side of the White House.
Those people were carried out just a few minutes ago, probably from this latest round, people injured in this latest round of fighting that started about 20, 25 minutes ago now.
They wouldn't have been injured in those tank firings, probably in some of the small arm firings that we heard before, for the injured were carried out before those tanks did fire upon the building. A lot of those anti-Yeltsin demonstrators that had come from the north of this building, from near the Kremlin, the Arbat Street, and had come up to the steps of the White House, were driven back by some troops that had AK-47s. Those troops we saw earlier approaching the White House from just below our bureau.
Are you able to get a shot for us once around the back there, as we see quite a bit of smoke coming from around the back there?
We do have a camera on the back. That's Bruce Conover at the back of the Russian White House. I think you see an armored personnel carrier there around the back. It's a very smoky picture. It's hard to make out what's happening there.
That would be the top of a football field that is directly to the rear of the White House, where that APC is. Earlier we saw APCs about 6 o'clock this morning. We saw, or 7 o'clock this morning when the assault began, we saw those APCs running over the wire meshed fence that surrounds that football field to give clear access to a line of APCs that had gathered in the field. As you can see now, that field is empty. Clearly those APCs have already gone in to the back of the White House. Just above that section of football field is the low building. It was a bunker that many of the defenders of the White House were sleeping in. That was where a lot of their ammunitions were stored. It was where they were training women and men to defend the White House.
Have either one of you been able to find out any more information about what a top military aide said, that even though the operation was slow to reduce those casualties, that the building must be cleared by dusk? It's a little bit after 4 p.m. in Moscow right now.
Now, we have been trying to confirm that ourselves. We have been unable to reach that military aide. Again, we only know what Reuters has reported, that Dmitry Volkogonov, who is a Yeltsin advisor, told them that he was hoping the operation would be over by sundown. He also said apparently that anybody who raised their hands in the air and put up a white flag and dropped their weapons would be spared, but that there would be no guarantee for those inside who started all of this bloodshed. Clearly, he was talking about Ruslan Khasbulatov, the chairman of parliament, and Alexander Rutskoy, Mr. Yeltsin's former vice president.
Some of the military sources earlier reported that when they went in under a ceasefire, a lull in the fighting, when they did go in, the Oman, to help clear some women and children from inside the building, they were, and this was reportedly agreed upon from those inside the building, that they were fired upon. We can't confirm that. That's military sources saying that. But it could be possible. It could also be. We haven't seen any people coming out with white flags out of entrance 20, which is in the back of the Russian White House. That was where they were told by government loudspeakers directed at the building. They were given instructions if they wanted to come out entrance 20 with white flags. There you can see entrance 20. That is in the back of the Russian White House. That was where just a few moments ago you saw there's some soldiers moving in.
Exactly. It looked as though some government troops were just running in through the smoke.
Do you have any other information on the overnight curfew?
There again are some people with white flags coming out, carrying a stretcher with wounded. Sadly, there were a lot of older men and women and even some young children among those demonstrators. There was a little girl, Natasha, 4 years old, who I can only wonder where she is. Her grandmother said they would stay there until the bitter end. She'd been there from day one, camped outside of the Russian White House building.
Do either one of you have any more information about the overnight curfew?
That was imposed by Mr. Rutskoy within the building, apparently. There was an overnight curfew banning all movement within the building. That would make sense because of when we were staying there overnight, both Claire and I took turns sometimes staying in the building overnight with our crews. And we often, when you would go down the darkened hallways, say to try to get to Mr. Khasbulatov's office or to Mr. Rutskoy's office for a comment or an update about what was going on, the halls, of course, were darkened because there was no electricity. The electricity had been cut off and was cut off last night. Because of those darkened hallways, you would often hear the defenders of the White House tell you to halt, and a flashlight would appear on your face. You wouldn't be able to see who was behind the flashlight, and you would hold your credentials out to show who you were, and they would ask where you were going, and then they would tell you to proceed. So certainly that curfew would have been in effect in order to avoid confusion within those long, winding corridors, as we've described before.
Eileen, how difficult was it for you to get back and forth to be able to go in and out of the building?
Well, when the government barricades went around the building about towards the end of last week, it was very difficult for us to get through. It was actually towards the beginning of Monday and Tuesday of last week. It was very difficult for us to get through. At times, we approached in the middle of the night and tried to climb through that football field. I tried to climb over the fence to get inside the building with our camera crew. That was during a night when we thought perhaps there might be an attack. There was another night when the defenders of the White House themselves said that an attack was imminent. We were on the outside. We were able to get through the government forces very easily, but there is barricades within the government perimeter that are defended by the defenders of the White House. There were men hiding in bushes. You could see the fire started by those tank shells inside of the White House.
Yeah, the building has been burning now for hours. The fires seem to come and go. It's been pointed out that these buildings don't burn readily because they're made heavily of concrete, but you do see the flames continually from that scorched front of the White House.
My understanding that this is a 19-story building and that the government troops have control of the first 4 or 5 floors. Is that right?
Well, that's what we had last heard. I would guess at this point that they've moved higher. It would seem that some of the flashes that we had seen coming from the inside of the building were on some of the higher floors, so they're probably just working their way up, and that would be our guess as to why there's the tank fire on the building right now, that they're trying to support those special forces inside trying to clear the building out.
The clock on the Russian White House stopped a long time ago at 5 to 1. It is well past that. It's 3 or 4 hours past that. It's right now, as you can see, the fire is still burning inside of that part of the building. There's 2 tiers of this building, and when the government forces said they had captured the first 5 floors, that would have meant that they had captured the lower tier of the building, where you could see in the front of the Russian White House the very tall buildings. It would be lower than that picture of the burning part of the building is right now. It's in that lower part of the building that the Congress Hall itself is, and it's in the front of the building from this vantage point where there was the room where we saw every day Mr. Hasbulatov holding his daily briefings to reporters.
Eileen O'Connor and Claire Shipman, if you'll just stand by there in Moscow. Leon?
Yes, Donna, although he may have left Washington with health care reform on his mind, President Clinton has been monitoring events there in Moscow.
Running towards entrance 8. Now, as the camera pans to entrance 20, you can see a tank that had approached the building. That entrance number 20. That was where a medical stand had been set up by the defenders of the White House. That was where their medical supplies were, so any wounded would have been taken down into that area.
There's more people. You see them with the white flags moving in. It looks as though some of them may be ambulance workers coming in from the outside to pull the wounded out of there.
Yes, they have the typical uniform of ambulance workers. It may be that this lull in the fighting is to allow the injured to be evacuated. In the front of the building, we are also seeing doctors approaching.
There they are, running into the front
with stretchers. Now, if they're running into this lower part of the building, then it may well be, this is the part of the building that we would have thought the government troops were talking about when they said they had taken the bottom 5 floors of the building. This is that lower ledge of the building that they would have taken. It looks like they're tending to something right there. Someone.
I can't get a good look at what that is either, Eileen.
No. It's hard to tell.
It looked like they may have dropped something because it looked too light for one. If it was someone that man was carrying it, it didn't look like it was a person. It was too light of a load.
And they've clearly moved all of those Parliament demonstrators off of the front steps. It seems as though the only people remaining there now are soldiers.
Well, we continue to look at the live pictures. Eileen and Claire, joining us now to talk more about the situation in Moscow is Vladimir Nadin. He is the Washington bureau chief for the Russian newspaper Izvestia. Mr. Nadin, as you look at this, have you been able to talk to any of your colleagues back in Moscow this morning?
Yes, I've been talking to my editor-in-chief and to some friends of mine. They told me that the rest of the Moscow is calm enough, but all my friends and my colleagues are watching what's going near the White House. And all the newspapers, including the ones which support Mr. Hasbulatov and Mr. Ruskoy, will appear today in Moscow, and readers will have chance to have different opinions about these events.
Are they hopeful for negotiations?
No, not very much, because public opinion generally is very strictly against people who are in the White House. They believe they are responsible for bloodshed near Ostankiно TV.
Do they expect any split maybe in the military, that there could be some faction that would go there? And how about the rest of the regional leaders all across?
Oh, no, they don't think so. They think that military now strongly support Mr. Yeltsin. He was good enough to convert public opinion, his public support, into a military one. Probably it would be not much easier to convert after his victory this military support once again into public one. You know that all the victories write out their bills and Mr. Yeltsin, who appears to be the winner, will have to pay the bills. I mean economic situation, crime, activity in Moscow, corruption, and for the next 2 months he will be a sort of a democratical dictator, and this is a very responsible situation.
Most people are interested then in seeing the reforms continue?
Yes, Mr. Yeltsin is very much dedicated to the continuation of democratical reforms, and my colleagues expect that now we'll see a very fast implementation of previous governmental plans. But we see now a lot of difficulties. Without some enemies, without resistance from Mr. Rutskoy and Mr. Hasbulatov, it would be not very much easier to do this. I mean that public opinion always supported Mr. Yeltsin, comparing him with his opponents.
Mr. Nadine, are you able to see our live pictures here?
Yes, I do.
Eileen, were you going to jump in there? Go ahead.
Yes, there's a raging fire now in the upper floors of the Russian White House. Clearly started from those rounds of tank fires that we had heard and seen earlier, those tanks firing from Kutuzovsky Bridge just below our bureau and our vantage point right here. As you can see, that fire is raging in the upper floors of the White House. That would be where the defenders had retreated to. The government forces had come in underground. Also, the indication would be that they would be on these upper floors because as those doctors came in and as a tank came in towards entrance 20, they were not fired upon from within the White House. So the defenders of the White House would appear that they are going to the upper floors.
Eileen, are those two different pictures that we're seeing live here? This one that we're seeing where it looks like it's engulfed with two windows, and then it looks like perhaps it's the back side with that other raging fire that we just saw that's smoking up the back there?
Yes, it very well could be. This part of if the whole floor there, or at least a large section of that floor, is on fire, then certainly that could be part of the fire that you're seeing from the rear of the building. Yes, indeed, it is.
This is the back of the building. That's right. This is from Bruce Conover's camera, the back of the White House. Clearly, they've been hitting the back as well as the front.
We've also had a report by Associated Press that there is a government curfew, a curfew imposed by Mr. Yeltsin tonight in Moscow that will go from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. and that 5,000 soldiers will be patrolling around the streets of Moscow and stopping cars at random and checking them. For certainly because of the firefight outside of Russian television yesterday, there were some of the defenders of the White House were outside the White House when this siege began.
With Eileen O'Connor and Claire Shipman along with us this morning on CNN is Vladimir Nadine. He is the Washington bureau chief for the Russian newspaper Izvestia. Mr. Nadine, as you look at this, what do you and your colleagues think?
Well, I've been many times in that building, and I think that right now it's very difficult for Mr. Yeltsin also to watch this scene because in August '91, this was the building which saved him and his ideas in Russia. And of course, this is a tragic page in our history. But as far as I know, a lot of people support this decisive action of Mr. Yeltsin.
Mr. Nadine, as you say, it's a tragic page in your history. Would you deem it a necessary page in history to go on to democratic reforms?
Many people think so, but it's a great pity that Russian democratic revolution, which proceeded, as you know, almost without blood, now has a lot of lives, at least 500 more lives, and the blood, it's bleeding now. So this is a great pity that we could not avoid this in our development, in our proceeding to the democracy all of us seek.
Eileen and Claire, I think that Mr. Nadine is able to hear you as well if you need to visit with him or have questions.
Well, you can see right now these are troop trucks moving in along the Naberezhnaya. They are going in front of the Russian Parliament building underneath the bridge, obviously probably to reinforce some of the troops inside. That fire that we saw in front of the building and the fire behind the building are perhaps on the same floor, but are perhaps separate. Mr. Nadine spoke about the regions. I wonder if he feels, as I do as an observer to this, that perhaps what happened in August 1991 after the coup collapsed, after Mr. Yeltsin and Mr. Gorbachev came back triumphant, the republics around the former Soviet Union, one by one, declared independence. I wonder if Mr. Nadine thinks that perhaps some of the regions who have been itching to declare independence may use this moment to do so.
But you know, Ms. Shipman, we were very much excited at that time with the victory. There was no such a burden as now. There were 3 people who died at the coup, but general mood was very optimistic. Right now, it's not as much optimistic as it used to be.
Wasn't it somewhere in Siberia that they were threatening to use this, in fact, though, Mr. Nadine, that if things didn't shape up as they saw was fit, that perhaps they might break away?
Oh, this is a very interesting question. I don't think that any of the provinces are going really to break away. They need Moscow. They need the assistance of the center, and mostly they insist on peaceful solutions. Right now, I believe that Russia will stay united, mostly because what our provinces demand now is like American states. It's not too much. They want to be independent. They want to have economic independence. But I believe that they would support democratic development in Moscow.
CNN takes a quick break from our coverage, our live coverage in Moscow, and we'll be right back.
CNN International updates global weather 24 hours a day. Look for the forecast for these cities in your region and travel advisories worldwide. CNN International, your source for news, business, and sports, is now the place to turn for global weather 24 hours a day.
Is CNN International.
Perlen, Glanz und Schönheit. Ein verborgener Schatz seit über 1000 Jahren. Zur Zeit der Ming-Dynastie haben die Chinesen die zauberhafte Wirkung von Perlen in Form einer wundervollen Creme.
Standing by there in Moscow with the latest.
Right now, you can see some of the government forces of Boris Yeltsin on the bridge across from the White House, getting back into their tanks. Those tanks have been in a position to fire for some time. They did fire half an hour ago upon the building. There's heavy casualties inside of that building. We have some dramatic footage just taken from our cameraman Anatoly just inside the footage, inside the Russian White House. There is a soldier beating upon some of the doctor beating upon some of the soldiers. He's so frustrated from all of the casualties.
They've put the prisoners up against the wall. We're just rolling you the tape as we have it here. The doctor is so upset about the casualties inside. He's taking it out on the troops.
Those were prisoners lined up against the walls outside of the Russian White House.
Again, this is an unedited CNN video taken by our own cameraman from inside of the White House. You can see the anger that this has provoked, seeing the...
That is alongside the White House. That is, those are some of the doctors that we saw, I believe, earlier with some of the stretchers approaching the White House.
Now, Eileen,
bystanders, soldiers firing in the air to disperse the bystanders. As you could see, the anger and frustration of that doctor, who it appears had been inside. There are reports of hundreds dead inside the building. Those reports may well not be exaggerated. Here, you can see stretchers coming up. This is tape, as we said.
Eileen, I'd just like to clarify something. What we were seeing there when we saw that one gentleman being escorted down the stairs, that was one of the doctors who has been treating the wounded. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is one of the doctors who was apparently inside the Russian White House.
And those people along the stairs there, perhaps some of those who were wearing those uniforms, were they pro-Yeltsin forces, or were those some of the prisoners that were taken from inside?
Well, the ones on the left were the prisoners that were taken from inside. They were there against the wall, obviously immobilized until they could be moved out.
You did see some of those prisoners had uniforms on there. You could see a militiaman's uniforms. Those are prisoners from within the Russian White House.
A lot of the militiamen who worked at the White House went over to the White House side, so although they were in their militia uniforms, they had defected long ago and were already serving the White House defenders.
Yes, these are defenders of the White House, those men in militia uniforms. Some of these men who are not in uniforms were too armed inside the White House. Outside of Mr. Hasbulatov's and Mr. Rutskoy's office, there you see some bodies. These are some of the victims.
Have you been able to get any additional information, perhaps from the doctors who are coming outside of the building now, of the number of casualties like these that we should expect to see?
We have heard reports of hundreds. There's 17 there right now that you've seen. This is unedited videotape. This is the doctor. We're going to come back to live pictures now. This is in the front, and this is behind the Russian White House. This is the back. Below that balcony along the bottom is entrance 20, where they had told people to come out and surrender.
It was difficult to tell.
There were reports.
I'm sorry, Eileen, but I just wanted to say it was kind of difficult to tell because of the quick cutaway from that shot. But it appears as though that fire in the back is getting worse. Is that what it appears to you?
It appears that the fire itself is spreading along that floor. It's on the same floor as a fire in front of the building, but there are different ends of the floor. The fire could well spread down these long corridors, especially because of backdraft.
We want to let folks know also that according to Reuters, it's a Reuters report, the ITAR TASS news agency is reporting that President Boris Yeltsin on Monday has suspended publication of a string of communist and nationalist newspapers, including Pravda.
Yes, we have just had that same report. That's not at all surprising. He is one of the complaints against Boris Yeltsin from the people inside of the parliament is that he has an iron grip on the media here. In fact, he does seem to control almost all of the publications and the television. It's not surprising that he would try at this point from his position of strength to squelch the few remaining who aren't in his camp.
It was, in fact, why the Russian parliament, the defenders of the White House, had gone over to Russian television yesterday to try to take over that broadcasting station. They said they wanted to get their voices heard, and have their voices heard inside of Russia. Gene Randall was there when the firefight outside of Russian television occurred. Gene, can you tell us how hardened these fighters are, the defenders of the White House?
Well, it seemed to be a very determined lot at Russian television Sunday night. There seemed to be a degree of organization. They were well armed. It was a concerted attack to take the building. At one point, they seized control of one of the floors of one of the major buildings, and it was a very heavy firefight, certainly the heaviest we had seen before today's assault by government troops on the Russian White House. It did, however, provide Boris Yeltsin with what I'm sure he felt was the cover he needed to move against the Russian White House today, because there was an awful lot of bloodshed. And anyone who was there found it very easy to believe that the death toll would be 20 or higher from that firefight last night.
Well, Gene, Eileen, and Claire, standing by in Washington at the State Department this morning is CNN's Ralph Begleiter, and he joins us now with his reaction from there. Ralph?
Well, Leon, Clinton administration officials here in Washington, in effect, gave Boris Yeltsin a green light to use whatever force he deemed necessary to bring the political conflict in Moscow to an end. Senior U.S. officials say Yeltsin had informed Washington that he was bringing in the Spetsnaz troops, the highly trained forces, which could only mean that Yeltsin anticipated an assault of some sort. Top officials staying in touch with the situation in Moscow told us before the assault on the Russian White House that the Clinton administration assumed there would be violence. It was unrealistic, in the words of one official, to think otherwise. U.S. officials say bluntly, "We are supporting Yeltsin and the Yeltsin forces in this particular confrontation." It's something of a risky policy for President Clinton. He has indirectly supported the use of force, and that could turn out to be embarrassing if today's assault turns out to have a heavy toll. But it's also the policy U.S. officials believe is most likely to promote democracy in Russia in the long run. Administration officials support the decision to back Yeltsin by repeatedly pointing out that Yeltsin, not the rebel parliamentarians in the Russian White House, was elected, supported twice in democratic ballots by the Russian people. And Washington could expect a kind of political payback in the future, expecting Yeltsin to strongly support the United States in a variety of initiatives around the world, from the Middle East to Bosnia to nuclear arms control. Leon?
Ralph, exactly what can you tell us about how much contact there has been between Boris Yeltsin and President Clinton up to this point?
So far, President Clinton has not been in touch with Mr. Yeltsin or with other senior Russian officials. However, at a lower level, Strobe Talbot, the administration's point man on Russia and the former Soviet states, has been in constant contact through the U.S. Embassy and Ambassador Thomas Pickering in Moscow with Yeltsin's political aides at the Kremlin, and the U.S., at least at this point, feels it has a good handle on what Mr. Yeltsin is doing, what he's thinking, and what his plans are.
How about what Mr. Clinton may be telling, or Talbot may be telling the Russian emissaries that they are speaking with? Exactly how is the U.S., or is the U.S. actually advising Yeltsin on how to handle this situation?
Well, that's an interesting point. Although the U.S. officials say that the United States is in touch with Yeltsin's people, officials here in Washington say there is no advice being given and that Mr. Yeltsin has not sought any advice from the United States on how to handle the situation. It's basically a case of staying in touch for informational purposes. Ambassador Pickering has been concerned about the status of the U.S. Embassy, which, as our viewers probably know by now, is only a stone's throw from the Russian Parliament building. So there's been some concern expressed about that. But otherwise, U.S. officials say no advice being asked or offered.
What is the word from the U.S. Embassy there this morning? We do have reports of one U.S. Marine actually being injured by stray bullet fire there.
That's right. There is a report from the embassy. U.S. officials confirm that one Marine guard who was moving from one post to another at the embassy compound was struck in the neck by a stray bullet. He has been taken to a hospital, and at the moment it seems he's going to be okay. Other Americans at the embassy compound, which is a fairly large compound in Moscow, are for the moment taking refuge in the gymnasium of the embassy. That's located below ground level. It's kind of a shelter area. At the moment there hasn't been any threat or assault on the embassy, but that's a precaution the U.S. is taking.
From elsewhere in the halls of the State Department this morning, have you heard anything else from any reactions from any other world leaders? We have heard this morning comments from the Japanese and from the British, who seem to be supporting Mr. Yeltsin.
Well, American officials say they're not, sort of reaching out and urging everyone else to come to Mr. Yeltsin's support. They say that's obvious at this point. It's already the case that the European community is supporting Mr. Yeltsin. They've just issued a statement, the British and the French, as you mentioned, the Japanese as well. So there is a groundswell of international support for Mr. Yeltsin.
Ralph,
I think most people feel there's no alternative.
All right, now, Ralph, we're looking at some live pictures of some activity there. Eileen, can you tell us what's going on?
What's going on right now is that these doctors are waving white flags. They're approaching the front of the Russian White House. As you can see, they have a Red Cross flag as well. They are trying to get into the front of the Russian White House, obviously to carry away some of the injured inside. Now, those doctors are coming from where we showed you just a few moments ago, from that area where we had that taped. They're now running away from the White House. It would appear that they have not been allowed inside, but they're being waved away from by either troops inside or by some of the defenders of the White House.
There have also been reports on the wires that the International Red Cross is trying desperately to get medical supplies into the country for what they say are hundreds of casualties in this crisis.
And as Ralph was pointing out earlier, one of the high stakes that Boris Yeltsin clearly, and part of the international community, part of the stakes in this game is clearly having good relations with Russia, because those inside the White House throughout last week were clearly very, very angered by the West's support of Mr. Yeltsin. They had some very strong anti-American sentiments. Many times they asked us where we were from, and when we told them we were from the United States, they would yell and scream at us and say, "Why are you for Yeltsin? Why are you for Yeltsin?" Mr. Antonov, the head of the Parliamentary Committee on International Affairs, tried to call the U.S. Embassy and have a meeting with them last week, and when the embassy did not make arrangements to have an immediate meeting, he said that the Americans were ready to watch democracy die.
Eileen, this is Ralph in Washington. I've been dying to ask a question of you that's slightly related to that. It seems to me there might be a domestic political cost for Boris Yeltsin as well in this assault this morning. Maybe you can answer it, maybe you can't, and if you can't, maybe you can look into it later. With the extensive fire that we have seen in the last few hours at the Russian Parliament building, I presume that those upper levels are the levels where the senior officials of the Russian government worked, and I also presume that that is the location for many, many documents that would be essential to Boris Yeltsin and to the Russian government in upcoming parliamentary elections, in upcoming presidential elections, in terms of who the precinct leaders are and that sort of thing. Are those records going up in flames? Do we have any idea whether any of that, I think, important political information might be being preserved? And a corollary question to that is, I think it's striking, at least from this point of view, far, far away, that there is no effort being made to put out the fire or to contain the damage to that obviously central political building for the Russian government.
Well, the fire is apparently in the floors where defenders of the White House are still in, at least in part of those floors. We had seen the flash from guns earlier coming out of those floors. And you're right, there were probably very important documents to the Russian government, at least to the parliament. But you must remember that a lot of the documents of the Russian government are still safe within the Kremlin, because the seat of the Russian government, while before the breakup of the former Soviet Union had been all within the Russian Federation building, it has now been slightly divided. Mr. Rutskoy's former office was within the walls of the Kremlin until Mr. Yeltsin had suspended him, and only recently did Mr. Rutskoy move his office over to the Parliament building.
Ralph, this is Claire. In fact, when we were in there yesterday, we were told by some of the deputies that they were in fact trying to shred and burn a lot of the records and papers there. Why they would be trying to do that is not exactly clear, but that's what a lot of them told us.
Claire, Eileen, can you, oh, excuse me, Ralph, it's Donna in Atlanta. Claire, Eileen, can you give us an idea where the tank and the other vehicles were headed as we were just looking at the live picture there? Right there.
Well, some of those would be headed up along the back of the side of the Russian White House. It's it's a road that leads behind the American embassy. It's between the Moscow Parliament, the Moscow City building, and the Russian White House.
And they're turning toward the White House right now, going along the river. That's going to head right up the ramp that goes up to the
White House.
It appears, yes. It appears it may be buses, which could in fact be coming up there to take some of those prisoners that we saw earlier lined up along that wall, because where that tank and those buses were going is down towards the river edge where some of those prisoners had been lined up. They may be trying to get those prisoners out of there.
Claire, this is Leon in Atlanta, and as we were watching this fire seeming to spread up in the upper floors of the building there, and you say that you were actually inside yesterday speaking with some of these parliamentarians and opposition members, it occurs to me that perhaps some of them went into this with the idea of becoming martyrs and hurting Yeltsin that way. Was there any talk of that sort of thing?
Well, they didn't, of course, openly admit that, but I think that for the last 4 or 5 days, that's been in a lot of their minds. And Alexander Rutskoy, perhaps the biggest martyr among all of them, he'd said outright that he intended to stay and fight until the last bullet flew, and that the blood would be on Boris Yeltsin's hands. So, yes, I think they dug themselves into a hole and then really were unable to get out of it, Leon. You can see now that there are the 3 new buses in front of the White House. Again, it's not clear whether they're there to take prisoners away or...
The firing has stopped, and now 2 APCs are lining up in front of the White House. It would appear that perhaps these troops are preparing for some kind of surrender, or at least allowing people to come out and have safe passage down these front steps of the Russian White House. As you can see, again, there are people with white flags running along the Naberezhnaya.
Eileen,
riverfront.
Eileen and Claire, if you'll just stay put along with Ralph Begleiter, we'll take a quick break here. What we want to do is we want to check in with Terry Keenan at the New York Stock Exchange and see if there's been any reaction as we continue to monitor the developments in Moscow. Terry Keenan is at the New York Stock Exchange.
Thanks, Donna. The crisis in Russia making for a day of wild price swings so far in world markets. But right now, those markets appear to be stabilizing a bit. The dollar and precious metals giving back early gains. Stocks are holding steady at this hour. Let's start with the currency markets. In overseas trading earlier, the dollar soared, gaining more than 2 pfennigs against the mark. The dollar benefiting as a safe haven investment. But right now, the dollar is actually down slightly against most major foreign currencies. Bond prices are now recovering from earlier losses. The Treasury's 30-year bond up 6/32 in price, yield at 5.97%. Precious metals also retreating from earlier gains. Gold down almost $4 an ounce.
Their heads. They are going in between two lines of troops. Those are on the steps of the Russian White House. That's the front of the Russian White House, facing our vantage point here.
It looks as though they may be, some of them may be deputies who have agreed to give up at this point.
Go ahead, Donna.
Thanks, Eileen. It may be that perhaps they're paying attention to the deadline that we were talking about earlier. It's about 10 minutes to 5 Moscow time, about 10 minutes to 10 Eastern time. Moscow 7 hours ahead of Eastern time. And we had talked about the top military aide before to Yeltsin, who had said that that building would be cleared out, must be cleared out by dusk. And dusk happens around 6 p.m. your time?
Yes, and as you can see, there are many, many more men coming out. And as you can see, they have their hands behind their heads. They're walking down the front steps of the Russian White House. This looks like a mass surrender. Meanwhile, on the backside, we're seeing government forces coming in from the shelter behind a tank, going into entrance 20. Now, that was the entrance that earlier government loudspeakers had told the people inside the Parliament building that they should exit from and that they should be carrying white flags. That's entrance 20 along the back. Here is entrance number 1. This is the front of the building, and as you can see, these men have their arms raised over their head. Many of them are in fatigues. They would appear to be the defenders of the White House, many also just in plain clothes and suits. Some of those, obviously, some deputies from within the White House.
Perhaps many of them captured, perhaps some of them surrendering, but many of them could well have been prisoners that had been taken and were held inside while the men made a sweep of all of the floors of the White House.
A military spokesman for Boris Yeltsin's government said that the report of 500 dead from within the building came from within the building, from supporters of the White House, from supporters of the Congress, and that it was grossly exaggerated. This military spokesman stressed that the military had been told and did, in fact, take every precaution possible to minimize the loss of life within the Russian White House. We did see many lulls in the fighting. We heard that there were loudspeaker addresses to the back of the building asking people to come out with their hands up during those lulls in the fighting, and we were told by military commanders on the ground that they had been told not to fire upon the building, to allow the assault troops to do their work and clear out the building.
Eileen or Claire, did we ever get any real good confirmed numbers of the number of folks who were in the Russian White House? And also, from our vantage point with this camera shot, or if we'll be able to zoom in, do you think you'll have a chance to see Hasbulatov or Rutskoy should they come out?
I don't think that Hasbulatov or Rutskoy would be coming out with this group of people, but we may be surprised. You never know, but they it looks as though there are at least 70 coming out so far, but both Hasbulatov and Rutskoy had indicated they did not want to surrender. Again, they have been captured and may have no choice at this point. As for the accurate count of people inside, when we were there yesterday, there were no more than a couple of hundred deputies, perhaps less than that. The crowds outside were large, 1,000, maybe 2,000, but not many of those crowds were inside of the building when we left late last night.
Claire, this is Leon here. Speaking of those crowds, what is their reaction now outside there as they see this capitulation?
Well, This is Eileen. Down on the ground when Pavel Grachev was speaking to the troops earlier on top of those tanks, there was a mixed reaction from the crowd watching this White House. As he got back into his car, some of the crowd shouted, "Shame, shame," and jeered him. But then others in the crowd were cheering as each tank that fired hit the White House. So certainly this crowd outside, spectators of this siege, their opinions are mixed.
We were just seeing a shot.
Leon, it's Gene Randall in Moscow. If I can pipe in for just a second. Clearly, Boris Yeltsin was willing to take the risk of storming this building, willing to take the risk that people like Khasbulatov and Rutskoy would become political martyrs in the long run. But the fact is, he didn't want to take the risk of a prolonged battle here, retaking this building. This is clearly what he wanted. What we are apparently seeing, well...
Now we're hearing gunshots now.
Yes, sniper fire. It would appear fire coming from the right-hand side of that picture. The crowds are running. Again, these crowds are not necessarily Parliament supporters. Most of these people are just onlookers. They've been trying to get closer to the action all day to see what's happening, and they've been running back and forth as the firing has come from one side or the other.
Any idea where that sniper fire was coming from?
It appeared to be coming from the side of the building, and since they were running away from the building, it would appear that it was coming from inside the building. Now, a lot of those people, though, had in fact come down from the Arbat, where we were told there were 700 pro-Congress, anti-Yeltsin demonstrators earlier today, causing a lot of trouble for riot police. So many in this particular crowd on the side approach to the White House may in fact be some demonstrators trying to get back towards the White House.
But even to show just how fluid a situation this is, while that sniper fire is going on, there continues to be a parade of people coming out of the White House, apparently surrendering to the government side. And once again, Boris Yeltsin wanted this to be settled very quickly.
It'll be interesting to determine whether or not it's a matter of miscommunication within the White House, whether or not they know they're actually surrendering.
Well, certainly the communications within the White House were very, very difficult because only a few of the upper echelon of the people inside the White House, Mr. Khasbulatov's staff, Mr. Rutskoy's staff, had walkie-talkies, and all the internal phones within the White House were not working. So it would be difficult to speak to all the defenders of the White House. And as Claire and I were pointing out before, what the various groups in the White House were fighting for different causes, some of them more hardline than others.
And it's interesting to note, too, that there were a number of attempts made, it appeared, to negotiate or surrender through, for example, an Interfax correspondent who was in the building. He had a walkie-talkie. They were people inside were trying to work through him to communicate with the government. We had a call from a deputy a few hours ago on a cellular telephone saying that they wanted to negotiate about a surrender.
Also with us is Michael Beschloss. He's a historian, and he's joining us, I believe, from our Washington bureau. Michael, as you look at this, is this the way you thought it might play out?
Well, I think probably for the last 12 hours, Donna. I think this is going to be very useful to Boris Yeltsin, as horrible as all this has been, to have what is virtually an unconditional surrender. If this had ended, let's say, halfway through the battle by negotiation, then in many ways the people who were against Boris Yeltsin could have said, violence really achieved our purposes, and we encourage others really throughout Russia to use the same tactics in order to get the Yeltsin regime to get into us.
And so you're saying that somebody has to take the responsibility for this, and that probably will fall on the shoulders for the first violence with the hardliners?
Well, I think that's right. And also, needless to say, the winning side always has the ability, at least at first, to shape the way a crisis like this is seen. Take a look back to August 1991, when Boris Yeltsin defeated the coup plotters in the last gasp of the Soviet Union. Those coup plotters were able to be put into the dock, brought out in public, shown in a rather humiliating fashion. That really gave a great deal of energy to the Yeltsin cause to show these people to have been the enemy.
Had he not had the support of the military, things could have been very different, though, right?
Things would have been very different, and I think this is the one thing that really emboldened him throughout this entire crisis, which was, as bad as the situation in the streets of Moscow was yesterday, he knew that he had the support of the military, the internal security police, and others really outside Russia, other important elements of government, as well as popularity among the people. That made it very likely that in the end he would prevail. I think if I could add, Donna, one problem this does raise is that leaders are not always entirely magnanimous in victory. There was one, I think, probably disturbing note in Yeltsin's otherwise very good statement last night, which suggested that perhaps in the wake of this victory, certain political groups would be banned. That's very much against some of the assurances that he gave Western leaders at the beginning of this crisis 2 weeks ago.
Michael, if you'll just stay there, along with our correspondents in Moscow, Gene Randall, Eileen O'Connor, and Claire Shipman, we'll continue our coverage. Leon?
Some local cable operators will be cutting away for a commercial message at this time. CNN's live coverage of the crisis in Russia continues.
Jetzt gibt es Miracle Blade 2, ein computerdesigntes Präzisionsmesser aus chirurgischem Stahl. Ein Messer, mit dem Sie einfach alles schneiden können. Achten Sie einmal auf unser Angebot. Wenn Sie jetzt anrufen und das Miracle Blade 2 bestellen, erhalten Sie gratis 2 Schälmesser und einen tollen Entsafter. Und das ist noch nicht alles. Zusätzlich
troops loyal to Mr. Yeltsin. It's also interesting to note, as Michael Beschloss was saying, that the backing of the Russian military was clearly critical to Mr. Yeltsin, and that point was constantly emphasized throughout the day. Pavel Grachev, in a large black ZIL, was directing this operation from the Naberezhnaya in front of the Russian Parliament building. As the end of this approached, or at least what we think maybe is the end approached, he came up on the bridge and spoke to the troops. He got out of his car several times, talking to the troops on top of the tanks. Tanks and soldiers who had been approached by some of the civilians. Some of the civilians had been speaking to them. So clearly he was trying to show how he was in control and how he had the backing of the military behind him and that he was directing this operation.
Michael Beschloss, it's Gene Randall in Moscow, if you can hear me.
Sure can.
Good morning.
Morning.
I wonder if you think Boris Yeltsin, if these pictures are not deceiving and we're seeing the start of a surrender by the parliament side, despite the sounds of gunfire which continue, I wonder if you think that Boris Yeltsin has a very delicate political task now, once he has solved this situation, and how he deals with those he has vanquished.
No one could say it better than that, Gene. This is a leader now who has got, in many ways, a more delicate and difficult political job to do than he did really during the last week, because here was a case in which force was used. Now he's going to have to do the very difficult job of dealing with his enemies in a way that, as I suggested earlier, is as magnanimous as Yeltsin was in August of 1991. In the wake of that Soviet coup, there really was not what you've seen so often in the last 1,000 years of Russian history, a witch hunt, an effort to really wipe out all those who were in opposition.
Michael,
now,
let's go
during
back.
the next...
Excuse me, Michael, let's go back to our Moscow correspondents because we hear some more gunfire. Clearly, this could still be a dangerous situation. This happened just a couple of minutes ago as we saw so many surrendering.
Again, this is firing from within the Russian White House outwards towards these people who have gathered on the side of the Russian White House. Now, some of those people may very well be Congress supporters. They had approached from the north where some anti-Yeltsin demonstrators had gathered earlier, many of them trying to get in through a field that had been often used by the defenders of the White House.
And one of the great potential problems in this situation all along has been the existence of ultra-radical groups which will be willing to fight to the end. And it's a great part of the fluidity of this situation. While there might be some kind of formal surrender underway, the fact is there could be a hardcore here willing to fight to the very last drop of blood, no matter whose blood it is.
Precisely, we've also had some...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say we've also had some recent reports that some of these random snipers have moved to various rooftops around Moscow and are just taking pot shots at police and army officers below.
And that's what I was going to comment with you, Gene, that probably since we don't have a real good idea of the numbers of folks who are in there, even if a lot of folks surrender without knowing how many are really there, you know, some folks could be holed up, and we had reports earlier of snipers in the clock tower.
Donna, not just the number, but the temperament of those inside the building.
In fact, if I could pipe in, I'm sorry, go right ahead.
On CNN, sorry, Michael, the people of CNN on the street say that some of that fighting is coming from the direction of the Arbat. That would be north of the Russian White House. That is where we had heard that earlier there were some snipers and that there were some pro-Congress, anti-Yeltsin demonstrators out there. And certainly some of the people that attacked the Russian television station last night had not been able to get back in to the White House. Those men were heavily armed. We heard some firefights close to a road that comes in from Russian television towards the White House near the Международный Hotel. We actually have tape of some government forces firing against snipers in the Mej Hotel. That's to the left of the Russian White House.
And if the major objective is retaking the Parliament building, the fact is, if these pro-Parliament forces spread themselves throughout other areas of the city, the danger could continue for quite some time.
That's why, Gina, this is Leon in Atlanta. That's why I was going to ask if you can see if there was any movement with the government troops to either fan out into the surrounding area, or if they're making another assault on the building, or what can you tell us?
Well, it's just a whole different situation. When you've got a building to go against, it's an identifiable target. Tactically speaking, you can lay out a plan. But if you're talking about urban warfare, it's a whole different situation.
Well, can you actually see any troop movements at the moment?
Right now, we are not seeing any troop movement at the moment. We are able to see the front of the Russian White House. All of the tanks and APCs are stationary, so are the troops. The only movement seems to be people trying to flee from the gunfire.
This is in front of the Moscow City building. That is a building that was, in fact, taken yesterday or Sunday, Moscow time, by anti-Yeltsin demonstrators. It was retaken early on in this siege of the Russian White House by Mr. Yeltsin's armed forces. There you see people fleeing along the side of that Moscow City building.
Michael Beschloss, did you want to pipe in with something a little bit
Yeah,
earlier?
the one point I was going to make, thanks, Donna, was that there may be a great fear among these people who are in favor of the Parliament against Yeltsin that in the wake of this victory there will be some kind of effort really to make them politically inactive. And as much as this action of yesterday by the anti-Yeltsin forces was an action of desperation, now we see an action of perhaps even greater desperation, which is that these snipers and other individuals trying to reverse the verdict of the last 12 hours.
Well, Michael, what's to become of those who were in the Parliament, including Hazbilatov and Rutskoy? What about their political careers? Are they over? Will they be punished somehow, do you suppose?
I think the jury is entirely out. If we go by what happened in the late summer of 1991, when Boris Yeltsin was in a similar position of having to deal with people who had plotted against him, the record is one of rather great magnanimity. The chances that these men will be active forces during the next number of months until a parliamentary or a presidential election is, needless to say, very unlikely. These people are going to be very much otherwise occupied.
Well, Michael, this is Leon in Atlanta, and you speak of in the next coming months. What occurs to me is there is no dispute that Yeltsin is a true revolutionary leader based upon what he's been able to do in the past and his being able to whip up support for his activities now. But actually, we're going to go now back live to Moscow as we see more people coming from inside the building. Can you tell us what's going on there now?
You can see many, many people coming from within the Russian White House. This looks like a massive surrender from within the Russian White House. But as we've said, communications in and around the Russian White House are, of course, completely difficult. All of these deputies their phones had been cut from the people, even the internal phones had been cut. So if they are surrendering, they may not be able to tell their supporters that they're surrendering, and many of the people on the long side of the building may not be seeing this or able to see it.
Eileen, are you surprised at all by the number of people we're seeing coming out? I know there's been a lot of question about how many people were actually inside. Last report that we had seen, or that we had heard from you on the ground there, was somewhere between 200, 250 or so.
Well, certainly, we knew there were at least 110 deputies inside the building, and yesterday, Claire was in there and saw a couple hundred of people. The problem is, it's very difficult. This building is huge with all these winding corridors and various rooms. And when I would be wandering the hall, sometimes I would open up a door and there would be 6 or 8 people inside a room meeting, and you wouldn't even know that there were that many people there. So In some ways, it doesn't really surprise me. Also, around the White House itself, there were a couple hundred demonstrators, at least 150 hardcore demonstrators who'd been there the entire 2 weeks, camped out under makeshift shelters. And yesterday, on Sunday, as the anti-Yeltsin demonstrators went over the government barricades into the White House, the numbers of those people camping out outside the White House clearly grew. There was, we were told, a tunnel from that bunker off to the back of the White House to the Russian White House building. So many people could have come in from there and down in. There were also a lot of defenders of the White House billeted in that bunker, in that low building, that they would not allow us to film. And Mr. Antonov, I asked him how many defenders of the White House, and he said, we'll never tell you.
Do you know where these people are being taken in these buses?
Well, I'm not sure where they would be taken, according to Mr. Yeltsin's statement. If they didn't surrender soon, and that was many, many, many hours ago, they would be treated as criminals. He went on television this morning with a nationwide address. He spoke of how he did not want to have to do this, how the people inside the White House and their leadership had provoked this, and that he said that they had Russia's blood on their hands, that they had spilled the blood of their countrymen, clearly putting the blame for all of this and for his own actions now on to the leaders, Mr. Ruslan Hasbulatov and Mr. Moskoy.
Claire? It's also interesting to note that, getting back to what Michael Beschloss was talking about and Mr. Yeltsin being magnanimous, he today has apparently moved to shut down a handful of opposition newspapers, Pravda among them, and Soviet Russia, Dien, Glasnost, the People's Gazette. So he is not wasting any time to try to shut these papers down. He is not known really for being a magnanimous leader. In fact, he's known for carrying grudges. That's really what seemed to motivate him for years in moving against Mikhail Gorbachev, was a grudge at the way he had been treated by ex-leader Gorbachev.
It was interesting at the beginning of this siege, some of the people, some of the reporters of the more independent press, the financially independent press, one of the deputy editors of Moscow News said to me that he knew that Mr. Yeltsin was incensed, personally incensed at Ruslan Hasbulatov's cracks at him throughout the last few weeks before he issued that decree against the Congress, and that some of the people, particularly some of the editors of some of the journals in Moscow, felt that perhaps Mr. Yeltsin had also acted slightly out of anger at some of the statements from the Congress members, statements of great disrespect for he and his office.
I think Boris Yeltsin is going to have, excuse me, Don, I think Boris Yeltsin is going to have to bear in mind now that he got solid support from Western democracies during this crisis, and he's probably going to have to demonstrate something of a return to the road of democracy, which he promised once this immediate crisis is over. Michael Beschloss may have some thoughts on that.
Yes, Gene and Claire, I think you both make some very excellent points. I think even the next 7 or 8 days may tell us a lot. I think there's a very great likelihood that even if this victory is as comprehensive as it is beginning to look, there is a great chance that there will be some large anti-Yeltsin demonstrations in Moscow, perhaps in other cities. And what you may see is a situation where the internal security police, perhaps feeling that the job they did during the last 8 days or so was not enough, and also emboldened by what has happened during the last 12 to 16 hours, will act without restraint and create some very ugly scenes. That, combined with crackdowns against the press and against opposing political forces by the Yeltsin government, could not only undermine his situation within Russia, but very much with governments around the world that up till now have been willing to walk with him.
As we continue to watch events in Moscow with our live coverage on CNN, we'll take a quick break here and back with more for you in just a minute. Russian White House. As you've seen on CNN Live, many people holed up inside the Russian White House were giving up. There you can see a live picture, and you see even more standing on the steps. Flames and smoke have been coming out of the building as government troops loyal to President Yeltsin fired rounds of ammunition. Reuters news agency says some 500 people are dead inside the building, but CNN has no independent confirmation of that report, and in fact, a top presidential military aide says that estimate came from deserters, and that estimate is clearly exaggerated, according to that top presidential military aide. Groups of people have been seen leaving the Parliament building, and that came shortly after doctors waving white flags tried to go inside. Only a couple of hours ago, 3 men carrying white flags came out of the Parliament building, joined a crowd of about 1,000 anti-Yeltsin demonstrators outside. Representatives of the hardline deputies reportedly are holding negotiations with the Russian defense minister outside the building, and Mr. Yeltsin ordered tanks to fire on the Parliament building to force opposition lawmakers out.
Tank has opened fire on the front of the White House.
That is Steve Hurst's voice in the background there when that happened earlier. Those inside say they will negotiate, but they will not surrender, but that is not true for many of them that have been coming out. Mr. Yeltsin said in a taped television address last evening that he had hoped that the two sides could reach an agreement and preserve peace in the capital. He denounced his opponents as criminals for unleashing what he called a bloody massacre. Today's attack by government troops comes after a weekend of violence in which hardline protesters hurled rocks. Here you can see a picture from last evening. Hurled rocks and fired guns at riot police. At least 20 civilians were killed. More than 100 others were injured. Lawmakers had barricaded themselves inside the Parliament building on September 21st, as you might remember, after Mr. Yeltsin disbanded Parliament and called new elections. Anti-Yeltsin forces also attacked the Russian state television headquarters, forcing 3 stations off the air. Government troops fought back to keep control of the complex. And we'll go ahead and go back to our live pictures from Moscow, give you some reaction as to how other governments are reacting to what's happening. President Clinton is receiving hourly updates on the situation. Mr. Clinton spent the night in San Francisco. He held a televised town hall meeting in Sacramento yesterday, where he said Mr. Yeltsin had bent over backwards not to have soldiers fire on anybody. The president is in San Francisco to address an AFL-CIO meeting. The Japanese government says it regrets there is bloodshed in Moscow, but it maintains its support for Mr. Yeltsin. British Prime Minister John Major says Mr. Yeltsin deserves the support of all Democrats inside and outside of Russia. And a French government spokesman says there are no other solutions than to support Boris Yeltsin. We have Eileen O'Connor, Claire Shipman, and Jean Randall with us in Moscow, and we have from Washington Michael Beschloss, who is a historian. Folks in Moscow, bring us up to date on what we see right now.
The latest is a political note we have heard, and that is that Ruslan Kaspalatov and Alexander Rudskoy, the deposed vice president, have apparently laid down a condition for their surrender. And they say it's the only condition. They want to be guaranteed safety by Western ambassadors here in Moscow.
We're also seeing still a fire raging from within this Parliament building. And there are some firefights to the north and also to the southwest of that building, towards the Международный Hotel. We had heard those firefights earlier. Apparently some of the anti-Yeltsin forces were caught outside the perimeter of the building when the siege began, and they have taken up positions in some buildings around the perimeter and are firing down upon government forces, and the government forces are returning fire. Also, I wanted to ask, Michael, this is Eileen, I wanted to ask you what you felt about what the regions might do. The regions this past week, through their support behind the Congress. Do you think that perhaps they might use, or at least some of the regions might use this as an excuse to declare some kind of independence?
I think that is not beyond the realm of possibility, Eileen. I think that's a very persuasive argument that's being made. I think one thing that we've seen during the last number of months is that Kaspalatov especially has been working very assiduously to build support in a lot of these parliaments outside of Moscow. And I think not only on the parliamentary level, but also among the people, you might see a reaction not terribly different from what we saw in late 1991, which is that Moscow is consumed in these internecine political struggles, and so therefore we should not allow our lives to be ruled by the center. We should demand greater and greater independence. As you know, Eileen, there have been a lot of instances of that already, areas refusing to pay taxes and otherwise pay fealty to the center. That's something we may see more of in the next number of weeks.
The leaders of the regions had met in St. Petersburg a week ago on the weekend and had come out in support of the Congress. And you're right, Michael, they had indeed threatened not to pay taxes if this was not resolved. This is behind the White House, more people leaving from the White House, obviously surrendering. There were a lot of women inside the White House. There were some children with the demonstrators. A lot of the women in the White House were serving or were secretaries. They were staff of some of the deputies, and they had stayed in the White House throughout this 2-week ordeal. Here's the back. That's entrance 20. That's where they were telling people to come out earlier to surrender.
Jean, when you were talking about the information that you got about Hasbulatov and Rutskoy wanting the guaranteeing of their safety from Western ambassadors, do you suppose that that might come from the U.S. Embassy that's so close there?
I'm sorry, Don, I missed the last part of that.
Do you suppose that there's a possibility, since the U.S. Embassy is so close there, that that might be a good way for the communication to come there from the Western ambassadors, the guarantee of safety that they're looking for?
I don't think so, Don. I think that's probably remote. As a matter of fact, we got the report from an Italian news agency, so the message may be going out to other Western embassies or an appeal to other Western embassies, but in any event, they say it's the only condition they will lay down for their surrender, and that is their safety being assured by Western ambassadors. It's problematic whether Boris Yeltsin would allow that, given his temperament about these two men. Yeltsin, of course, has said it had to be an unconditional surrender. That was it. White flag, hands on the head. And once again, these are people from inside the Parliament building who have just left that building. And they don't appear to be detained, as a matter of fact, by government troops. We're not quite sure why the distinction is being made, but again, we'd have to be much closer to be able to tell that. Here is the dramatic picture on the front steps of the Parliament building. A large group of those inside, now apparently in custody, ready to be taken away at some point by government forces.
Is there any...
Well, this is a dramatic picture, of course. It was preordained. This Parliament needed a popular uprising. It needed a considerable defection rate in the military. It got neither one of those things.
It's interesting to note, too, how cut off, you have to remember that, how cut off the people inside this White House were for the last 12 days. Mr. Rutskoy was constantly claiming support within the military, which did not seem to be forthcoming. But they were without communications to the outside, and rumor was building upon rumor within the halls of that Russian White House. I think Claire can comment upon that. She is, as well as I, spent a lot of time in that White House.
Exactly. A lot of the things that you would hear in there made absolutely no sense whatsoever. We hear reports that the floors were mined, or that Mr. Hasbulatov himself would say that the people who were going to storm the White House were a bunch of hooligans on drugs, and it was really, by the end, making no sense whatsoever.
Let me jump in here and get us to Terry Keenan at the New York Stock Exchange so we can get a financial update and see if there's any reaction there. Terry?
The American Embassy, we want to stress that the people along the residences inside of the American Embassy were evacuated to a gymnasium which is located underground, and they were safe, although a Marine was hit by a stray round, but he is, according to embassy spokesman, in fair condition, and he is going to be fine. He's already been taken away to a hospital in Moscow.
And for anyone who has just tuned in, the most dramatic development of the past hour or so is the apparent decision by most of those inside the Russian Parliament building, the White House, to surrender. However, the two major adversaries for Boris Yeltsin inside, Ruslan Hasbulatov, the Speaker of the Parliament, and Alexander Rutskoy, the deposed Vice President, have laid down a condition for their surrender. They say it's the only condition. They want to be assured safety by Western ambassadors, and that question remains up in the air at this point.
All right, CNN's Gene Randall and Eileen O'Connor and Claire Shipman in Moscow. Stand by. We'll be back with you in just a moment. Time for us to take a break. Our coverage continues in just a moment.
In Russia, about 40 minutes ago, groups of people started coming out of the Russian Parliament building. Not clear at this time if all the hardliners have left the structure. There have been isolated incidents of sniper fire as the people filed out, which sent a lot of folks scrambling for cover. After two major attacks by Russian troops, a huge fire erupted in the upper floors of the Parliament building known as the Russian White House. At that time, government spokesman said Army troops were in control of the bottom 4 or 5 floors of the building.
We're just seen a tank fire from Kutuzovsky Bridge. Here it goes.
Most recent attack began about a couple of hours ago as government forces again tried to bring an end to the two-week standoff at the Parliament building. Troops fired machine guns and tanks unleashed cannon shells at the structure. A military aide to Russian President Boris Yeltsin said as many as 500 people may have been killed in the Parliament building since yesterday, but a later report said that that figure may be exaggerated. CNN has no independent confirmation. Mr. Yeltsin has imposed an overnight curfew in Moscow beginning at 11 p.m. local time, about 5.5 hours from now. The ITAR TASS news agency says Mr. Yeltsin has also suspended publication of a string of communist and nationalist newspapers, including Pravda. President Yeltsin has reportedly left the Kremlin for an undisclosed destination. U.S. officials today said they are supporting Mr. Yeltsin in this conflict.
Now, let's get the latest from Ground Zero in Moscow. CNN's Eileen O'Connor is there. Eileen?
Well, right now you're looking at the front of the Russian Parliament building where you're seeing extensive damage and 100 or so defenders of the White House who have surrendered. They are surrounded by government troops. You can see the men in fatigues along the outer perimeter. They're being taken down towards buses. One of the buses that was pulled up there has already pulled away, apparently full of prisoners. These appear to be some of the defenders of the White House. Earlier, we did see some other people leaving from the back of the White House, and they were allowed to just leave and go into the city. Did not appear that they were being detained. Here comes another bus pulling up to transport some of these prisoners. As you can see, there's extensive damage in the front of that building and in the back. This is a view of the back of the building. Fire is still raging within the building on some of the upper floors. These are the floors to which the White House defenders had earlier retreated to. There was some tank fire upon those upper floors, which caused those fires within.
We're not sure if you can hear it, but there is an awful lot of gunfire around this general area. We can't be precisely sure where it's coming from. We had reports earlier that around the Arbat, the shopping promenade section of Moscow, there were pro-Parliament forces, snipers, but there is an awful lot of gunfire right now, and this may be a continuing problem, even if the immediate objective of the Russian Parliament building is solved.
There were snipers along some of the buildings. We heard shots coming from this direction. This is the direction of the Arbat Street. That's north, that's towards the Kremlin. There had been anti-Yeltsin demonstrators that we knew were along that street, and many of them may have gone into some of the buildings to take up some sniper positions. There was also some pro-Congress anti-Yeltsin demonstrators or defenders of the White House, perhaps inside the Международный Hotel, which is to the left of the White House. And they were firing down upon government troops. The government troops answered with rocket-propelled grenades against that International Hotel and Business Center.
Again, it should be pointed out there have been a number of anti-Yeltsin demonstrators on the streets today, but most of the people that we talked to on the streets expressed their full support for the president and what he was doing. It was not at all like the coup 2 years ago when a lot of the people besieged the tank drivers not to go to the White House and begged the soldiers not to attack the Russian people. Most of the people we talked to said, go ahead, the parliament deserves to be scrapped. They're the ones who started all the violence, and we support Boris Yeltsin.
Yeah, some of those people down on that bridge were yelling that Rutskoy was a beast and an animal, and that he was bringing it upon himself and the people inside, and that it was inexcusable.
Eileen, Jean, Claire, Leon here in Atlanta. Just wondering has there been any sort of announcement or anything over the television or radio there locally since we've seen this surrender begin?
Well, some of the pictures that we've been showing have been shown on Channel 6 in Moscow throughout this siege. And there was the announcement broadcast, certainly over all the channels, by Mr. Yeltsin announcing that he was going to take decisive measures. That was earlier this morning. That was at night, last night, Sunday night, your time. As you can see, these are some of the people that had been milling around outside of the White House. You can still hear small arms fired towards the Международный Hotel. That's off to the left of the Russian White House. It would appear that there were some of the defenders of the White House, perhaps who were caught on the perimeter on that siege on Russian television. They may have come back to the White House to defend the White House, found themselves outside the government perimeter, and started firing upon government troops. With us are two Italian journalists who made the report about the conditions of surrender for Mr. Rutskoy and Mr. Hasbulatov. Paolo, were you able to, this is Paolo Valentino
from Corriere della Sera in Rome. Paolo, what can you tell us what you heard from the people inside of the White House?
We met Mr. Rutskoy and Mr. Hasbulatov around 2:30. We get in just by chance, and Mr. Rutskoy told us that the only condition to surrender is that the Western ambassadors give him the guarantee of his life and of the life of the people who is with him, and that's the only condition they ask for to surrender.
Also with us is Enrico Franceschini from La Repubblica. What can you tell us what the scene was inside of the White House? Did you get inside?
Yes, we got inside on the 4th floor. The scene is a bazaar. It's no man's land. It's difficult to understand who's in charge of what. We just squeezed in a dark alley, and someone told us at the end of this alley there are Hasbulatov and Rutskoy. We met him. Rutskoy was wearing fatigue and tennis shoes with the Kalashnikov, and Hasbulatov was wearing a raincoat. He had death written on his face. He was very pale, and there were a number of bodyguards with them, a number of deputies. There was Rumyantsev, Baburin, and they seemed very nervous and very scared.
How have they been able to keep the government troops away from them so far? Was that clear from where you were in the White House?
I don't think they even tried at this point. I mean, there is a sort of no man's land between the 1st and the 4th floor. We just went through without any problem. We didn't see any sniper there, just a couple of Spetsnaz. And then we went up. It seems like if the attack is going on, but there is a sort of enclave where these people are closed in, are holed up, but there is no sign of fight or no sign of any attempt to attack. Actually, we saw as well a lot of people from Red Cross coming inside, taking out some wounded.
And also, did you see any of the wounded or the casualties inside of the Russian White House?
We saw a lot of them. They were taking them out one by one. There was a Cossack laying on the floor, and we didn't see pile of bodies, but certainly there have been a lot of casualties.
Was there an area perhaps too where women and children were given safety, a safe area for them?
Rutskoy said that there were a lot of women and children, but actually we saw right before at least 60 or 70 women and children coming out from the White House, from the basement. Rutskoy also said that there are 500 deaths.
He said that there are 500 deaths. The government spokesman from Mr. Yeltsin's side said that report was exaggerated. How did you feel about it? Do you think it was exaggerated?
I couldn't have a sense of that.
Are there government troops continuing to move in? Is there fighting going on inside?
Well, when we were there were constantly troops getting in and people surrendering and going out.
Gentlemen, let me ask you about the state of mind of Mr. Hasbulatov and Mr. Rutskoy. Did they give you the impression that they realize they have lost this battle, or that it will continue through other means in the future?
Well, they realize they've lost this battle, but asking for their lives, it means that they feel the war must be going on, that this is not over. You know, sometimes we think we might have thought that Rutskoy, a military man, an Afghan hero, could have preferred to die in the White House like Allende with the gun in his hands. but he looked scared and he looked like someone who wants very much to leave.
So these were not two men who were intent on becoming martyrs, in your opinion?
I would say no. I would say definitely not.
Even if they, at least Mr. Rutskoy, puts out some other reasons for that. He says that he has these two brothers with him inside, and that he said that his mother died, and he doesn't want his brothers die with him. And then he doesn't care about his life, but he cares about the life of his brothers.
Let me interrupt.
That was the main point of his
Thank you.
choice.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you all very much. We can get back to you in just a moment, but what we need to do is check in San Francisco. President Clinton is in California. He's pushing his health care reform, and he's been getting hourly updates on the crisis in Moscow. And CNN's Jill Doherty is traveling with the president, and she joins us now with the latest from there. Good morning, Jill.
Good morning. Well, at this point, U.S. officials say that President Clinton has not spoken directly with President Yeltsin and at this stage does not have any plans to tell him.
Savvy to pull this off. As you say, he's got to placate some people that he has a lot of disagreements with, and he's got to make a lot of people work together to get what he wants done. Does he have the savvy to pull that off?
Well, one thing that suggests that he does is really the record of the last 2 years. I think during all this, perhaps one thing we've overlooked is the miracle of what has occurred in Russia since the end of 1991. Boris Yeltsin has presided over a program that's demanded enormous sacrifice of the Russian people, has caused them enormous pain, also has caused them to live in a society that is no longer the superpower that it was once, very much in some cases the opposite. He's pulled that off and generally maintained his popularity. That suggests a leader of uncommon political talent. I think the two things where Yeltsin has really fallen short have been, number one, he's done a rather poor job in educating the Russian people throughout this period about the meaning of these sacrifices and the fact that they would have to withstand a period of pain in order to arrive at a more democratic, free market society. The other thing, more important, that Yeltsin has not done well is created institutions that run beyond him. For instance, over the last 2 years, if Yeltsin had disappeared from the scene, the situation in Russia would have been extremely unsettled. Now he has the opportunity to reverse that.
Let's go ahead and bring in our Moscow correspondents once again, Jean Randall and Claire Shipman and Eileen O'Connor, as we continue to look at a live picture and get the latest from there.
Well, what you're seeing again is the front of the White House still smoking from the recent round of tank fire. We have with us here, above the CNN bureau on the roof, the two Italian journalists we were talking with earlier, Enrico Franceschini from La Repubblica and Paolo Valentino from Corriere della Sera. They both just returned from inside of the White House, a risky journey. While they were there, they were able to speak both with Mr. Khasbalatov and Mr. Rutskoy. Could you tell us a little bit more about the atmosphere inside of the building?
Well, the atmosphere is very tense. As I was saying, Rutskoy said that he has tapes of orders given by the Yeltsin troops to shoot him and Khasbalatov and not let them come out alive of that building. Well, I don't know if that is true or not, but he said that is the reason why I'm asking as a guarantee that the foreign ambassadors help me to get out of here alive.
But what kind of help are they asking for? Are they asking for asylum or simply help getting out of the building?
He didn't talk about any request of asylum. He just talked about protection of his life, warranty that he can get out safely. And he's talking about him, about himself, about Mr. Khasbalatov, and about all the people who are with them.
Was there also any indication of firing or movements of government troops around where Mr. Rutskoy and Mr. Khasbalatov were?
Actually not. There was no, not at all. I mean, from the second floor we didn't see any more special forces there. There was this no man's land, and then when you get inside, it was only people from the Red Cross or people from the Rutskoy crowd.
Well, so you didn't see any government forces inside the building?
We were talking about 3 hours ago, but I had the feeling while I was there that they were kind of waiting to decide what to do, because I mean, it was not a problem to get that room. As we got there, as easily, some commandos could have taken them all in 5 minutes.
But again, just to be clear, because there's been a lot of confusion about this today, were there government troops at least inside of the first floor and on the first floor?
Definitely.
And on the second floor as well.
On the second floor as well. And we actually talked to the troops who first stormed the building, and they said, we are not Alpha, we are not KGB, we are not the special division, we are just simple paratroopers.
One of Boris Yeltsin's top military aides said this morning this operation could have gone a lot faster, but there had been a conscious decision to slow down the pace to keep down the number of casualties. From what you saw inside, is that believable?
Well, it's a tough question. It's difficult to say. Definitely there were long moments in which there was no fighting, no shootings, and I mean, they went very, very slow in.
Actually, inside the bureau of Mr. Ruskoy, there was a sort of a surreal calm, and that was the indication. I mean, they didn't shoot in that moment. There were no cannons shooting in that moment. And I had seen cannons shooting all the morning.
Paulo, did you see, as we saw earlier this week, across the doorway, some of those safes and the barricades from which the defenders of the White House could shoot out? Were any of those places abandoned?
They were all abandoned.
There were no barricades inside.
There were no more
I mean, we got in, as I said, from an hallway in which there were no armed soldiers in front of it. Nobody tried to stop us. They just asked, are you journalists? Okay, come in. Well, of course, there were people with guns inside the office of Kasbulato and Rutskoy.
Thank you both very much for joining us, and we'll go back to you in Atlanta right now.
All right, thanks. And we'll take a quick break, and we'll come back with more of our live coverage right here on CNN.
Again, about getting back to Boris Yeltsin, is he going to go the way of Lech Walesa? Is he going to be able to bring Russia to this point, but not necessarily have the political acumen to pull it off for the long haul?
That's a great comparison, Leon. You know, historians usually say that there's a great difference between a revolutionary leader, as Boris Yeltsin and Walesa are, and then a leader who is able to sort of build a bureaucracy and preside over it. Yeltsin was a terrific revolutionary leader. There are very few leaders who would have been as courageous and shrewd as he was in triumphing over the Soviet coup in August of 1991. Also, very few leaders would have been so bold as Boris Yeltsin as to take the gamble of radical political, social, and economic reform over the last 2 years. One question that is very much open is, now that Russia presumably would like to move to being a more settled democracy, whether he is able to do what he has not done very well over the last 2 years, which is to create institutions that will contain a political conflict of the kind that we've seen in Moscow during the last couple of weeks. The fact that this erupted in violence in the last 12 hours is a sign of the failure of that system. It's not a sign of the success of that system. He's got to help create a system in the future in Russia that will make sure that this kind of thing never happens again.
All right, now some local cable operators will be cutting away for a commercial message at this time. At CNN's live coverage, the crisis in Russia continues.
Only in the front of the building, it appears to have gone all the way to the back through that upper floor and along to the side. There's 2 stories now involved in this raging fire, and it looks like the building itself, at least the upper parts of the building, may be completely destroyed. Those are offices, former offices of the People's Deputies of the Congress itself.
Boris Yeltsin's idea with this military assault against the Russian Parliament building, the White House, was to have it completed by dusk. Well, it is dusk now in Moscow, and he seems to have pretty much accomplished his goal. A large stream of people has been coming out of that building for the past, hour or so. We saw a bus leave the scene with very heavy security not long ago. We have some reason to suspect, at least, that Ruslan Kasbulatov, the parliament speaker, and Alexander Rutskoy, the deposed vice president, were aboard. Earlier today, they had said they would surrender only if they were given guarantees of their lives from Western ambassadors. but we're waiting to confirm they have been taken away from the building. But as you can see, that building is pretty well engulfed in flames.
Some of the T-80 tanks, which had fired upon the front of the White House along the bridge, are now turning around, if you can see them. They are looking like they're moving away from the White House.
They've been positioned there for most of this day, and from time to time have fired salvos of 125 millimeter shells into the Parliament building. Those shells responsible for the fires that we see now.
Have you been able to see whether or not there have been more surrenders from the building in the last few moments?
No, there still appears to be a knot of some of the same prisoners that were there earlier on the front steps of the Russian White House building.
And it's been very difficult to ascertain just exactly how many people were inside, so it's difficult to know if this surrender now is nearly complete. We suspect it is, but we have no firm way of telling. And once again, these forces will have to go inside that building to make sure, floor by floor, that everyone is out.
And we have to stress that that will be a very difficult task, and there is no way of guaranteeing, even with this large-scale surrender, that all of the forces defending the White House are out, because certainly the people surrounding the White House and those within the White House were not unanimous in their support for Mr. Rutskoy or Mr. Hasbulatov, not necessarily. Many of them had their own causes to fight for. One thing they were united in was their anger against Boris Yeltsin. But some of those hardline demonstrators vowed to fight until the end, and there may still be some groups in that building. It's a very difficult building. It's a maze. There's an inner courtyard which people can approach upper floors by fire escapes which would not be visible to government troops. So there's a lot of ways to maneuver around that building. There's many stairwells along each floor that they could go to.
Eileen and Jean, we'll come back to you in just a quick moment, but as we have done all this morning, we want to check in once again at the New York Stock Exchange and see if the events are having any effect on Wall Street at all. Terry?
Thanks, Donna. There is still relative calm in markets across the globe at this hour. That in hopes the violence in Moscow is nearing an end. Let's start here on Wall Street, where trading has been underway for more than an hour and a half. Taking a look at the Dow Industrials, you see in the upper left-hand corner, they're down about 2 points. The other major market indexes are slightly to the upside. Even in Germany, where big banks have millions of dollars in loans to Russia, the market was calm. The DAX index closed up more than 11 points. Stocks in London higher as well. The FT 100 up 27 points, and in Paris, the CAC 40 up more than 13 points. More wild swings today, though, in the currency market, where the dollar is now lower after a sharp rise overnight. Right now, the dollar is down a half penny against the mark, off nearly a cent against the pound. It's down a third of a yen against the Japanese currency. And a reversal of fortune as well in the precious metals market, where gold is now down $2.80 an ounce. Silver is off a penny at $4.05 an ounce. And finally, an official at Russia's main oil company says production is more or less normal today despite the crisis in that country. Russia is still the world's second largest oil supplier. And that's the latest in business news. We'll keep you posted throughout the day on the market reaction to the events in Russia. I'm Terry Keenan at the New York Stock Exchange.
Terry, thank you. And CNN continues live coverage of the situation in Moscow after this quick break.
If you've ever said, the newspapers are full of ads these days, you might consider that without the ads, there'd be a lot less newspaper, so you'd get a lot less news. In fact, the real news would be right here. So you choose. All the news that's news, or just the news you can afford? Advertising. The right to choose.
coverage of the crisis in Russia. In Moscow this morning, CNN's Gene Randall, and joining us from Washington, political historian Michael Beschloss. Michael, let me ask you one question about a name that should be, I'm sure, a person who's watching all of this with great interest, and we have not discussed very much, Mikhail Gorbachev. What do you think is going through his mind as he sees this whole thing play out?
I think Mikhail Gorbachev would have liked very much to see violence avoided, and he also, for the last 2 years, has been looking for political opportunities. When the Soviet Union died, I think he would have liked to have a role, perhaps as the head of the Commonwealth of Independent States, should that have turned out to be a more important organization than it is proven to be. He made a statement, as you know, Leon, within about the last 15 hours, criticizing Yeltsin's use of force, which I think in retrospect looks a little bit dated. I think Gorbachev probably will suffer something of a political setback as a result. But you know, the other part of this is how Boris Yeltsin is going to be affected. No leader can go through an experience like the one we've seen over the last 12 hours and remain the same man. Much has properly been made of the fact that this is the worst political violence in Moscow since 1917. I think when Boris Yeltsin on the 21st of September moved against the parliament, he never had a strong idea that the end of the story would be the burning of that parliament building and the kind of bloodshed we've seen. How that's going to change him, we'll only see the first signs during the next week. Will he become a more autocratic leader, one who says, I should have acted tougher sooner, or will the use of force make him disinclined to act boldly in the future? We don't yet know.
But what's your feeling? What do you think we'll see? What kind of Boris Yeltsin do you think we'll see? He's going to have a 6-month period. It appears, if his plan plays out as he would like it, he's going to have a 6-month window or so where he is pretty much going to be the only one in charge.
Yes, well, the arresting thing is that there are both of those sides to Boris Yeltsin. This is someone who operates in peaks and valleys. During the summer, when this impasse occurred between Yeltsin and these forces in the parliament, Yeltsin was so quiescent that many in the West wondered if he really had the steam to try to do something to resolve this. Then suddenly on the 21st of September, he came out swinging. This is a leader who emotionally goes through ups and downs. He also has, as I've suggested, an autocratic side that's shown itself in his political behavior during the last 3 or 4 years. When he became the undisputed leader of Russia at the beginning of 1992, people were, in many cases, very worried that he would rule as an autocrat. On the other side, this is someone who has never been through the ordeal of initiating this kind of violence before. How all this comes together.
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are seeing some firing going on there in Moscow, and Gene Randall is standing by. Gene, what's going on there?
Yes. Hi, it's Gene Randall. As you can probably see,
the mic's up.
Appears so we may be having
right now. You can see tracer fire right now coming from a building along the new Arbat Street. Clearly, that is coming from, we'd imagine, pro-Congress people. They are firing out indiscriminately in all directions along that building. We had heard that there were snipers along that area, and as you can see, that is now in evidence. There are many, many shots coming out. They are coming in all directions. A few of them whizzed by us on this rooftop.
Eileen, Leon here in Atlanta, can you tell us, are they firing at buildings or are they firing at aircraft?
They don't seem to be firing anything in particular.
No, they just seem to be firing outwards. Earlier, there was a few responding shots from within the Russian White House itself that may have been some government troops inside thinking that the firing was coming in upon them.
Eileen, can you tell us what that building was, that part that we're looking at, the live picture now, that looked like it was hit several times?
This is a building, this is an apartment building. It does appear that it was hit. It may have been hit from, no, those are lights inside the building. This is an apartment building. It's actually the building of some of the elite in Moscow because it has views of the Moscow River It's on an avenue that goes down to the Kremlin. Olympic skaters and ballerinas often have apartments, or did in Soviet-era times, have apartments in that building.
Gene, moments ago, you observed that Moscow at large was remaining calm throughout all this. Is this evidence of a spread out into the general city area of this violence?
Well, this is not far away from the Russian Parliament building itself, so it's still in the same general vicinity. But once again, it's beyond the perimeter of the building, and so it could easily spread a feeling of fear, at least beyond that building.
How broad a perimeter do the government troops have set up? Can you tell?
Well, the perimeter varies in sections away from the building. Sometimes it's as many as 4 or 5 blocks away. Sometimes it's as close as a few hundred yards away from the perimeter. The perimeter that is in that direction is fairly close to the building, so fairly far away from where those shots were being fired. There are a lot of innocent bystanders just standing down at the base of the Russian White House and at the base of the Moscow City building, people who had come, young people who were saying that they weren't afraid, they wanted to see, with no particular political persuasion. They were just there observing, and we have heard that some bystanders earlier in the day at least were hit by some stray rounds.
Has it been a while since you've seen anybody else come out of the Parliament building and surrender?
Yes, it has, and right now the front steps of the Parliament building are pretty empty at the moment. There's a few government troops below the first entrances of the building, but that's about it. The buses have pulled away.
And the firing for the moment has stopped. It could easily be a case of after-the-fact bravado by hardcore supporters of the Parliament. It could also be a case of the message not having gotten through, that in fact this siege of the building for the most part is over.
I don't know, Gene, what seems odd to me is the lack of any sirens of any kind. Do you see any sort of action by any emergency facility, agencies or any of the military moving around?
We see very little movement at the moment, very little.
How about some of the folks that were gathered? Do you see them dispersing more than they were? And earlier in the week, you know, we were talking about how a lot of the folks were really generally apathetic about the situation. Do you find that as it's geared up now that there is more interest in it?
Well, I think the general apathy has continued, but the fact is today we had bystanders, and when you have gunfire, apathy is perhaps sometimes tough to sustain, especially if you're in the immediate area. But for the most part, people in this city have just done end runs around this crisis, being more involved in the problems of their own lives.
Certainly most people stayed away from this area of the city today, and a lot of the other sections of the city, life was going on as usual. People were going to work, waiting for the bus. Even below here, we saw people throughout the day walking their dogs, even as close as the bridge where those tanks are. Those tanks have stayed in position and have now maneuvered into a position where they are still facing the Russian White House. So they clearly do not feel that this battle is over because they are still remaining in position.
All right, well, we'll take a break at this particular point. Thank you very much, CNN's Eileen O'Connor and Gene Randall joining us live from Moscow. I'm Leon Harris at the CNN Center in Atlanta.
I'm Donna Kelly, and CNN and Company is coming up next with Mary Tillotson.
Is CNN International.
Sind Sie auch über 50? Entschuldigen Sie die indiskrete Frage, aber ich bin selbst gerade 60 geworden. Da macht man sich natürlich so seine Gedanken über die Vorsorge im Alter und die Absicherung der Angehörigen, falls einem was passiert. Ja, und dann bin ich auf den 50-Plus-Vorsorgeplan gestoßen. Eine Lebensversicherung nur für 50- bis 70-Jährige. Von Quelle Versicherungen. Denn Quelle hat hier die niedrigsten Beiträge. Schon mit 1 Mark am Tag sind Sie dabei. Anruf genügt. 0180 381 81 81. Dann kommt Ihr persönliches Angebot ganz einfach mit der Post. Und Sie werden garantiert aufgenommen, ohne Gesundheitsprüfung. Ich jedenfalls habe alles geregelt und das für nur 1 Mark am Tag. Machen Sie es doch wie ich. Rufen Sie einfach an.
York Stock Exchange. Here on Wall Street, a muted reaction to the violence in Russia, that in sharp contrast to the nearly 70-point sell-off we saw 2 weeks ago when the situation began to escalate. Right now, the Dow Industrials are off just 1 2/3 points at 35.79. The pace of trading is heavy, 83 million shares traded so far. The other key indexes are mostly higher. Only the American Stock Exchange index is lower. Bond prices pulling back at this hour. The 30-year bond up just 3/32 in price, the yield at 5.98%. In a highly volatile commodities market, precious metals prices are slipping after sharp gains overnight. Gold down $2.90 an ounce, silver off a cent, platinum falling $3.20 an ounce. The market taking the Russian violence as the beginning of the end to political uncertainty there. Oil prices are sliding. Traders say Russia's oil exports have not been disturbed by the crisis in Moscow. Late sweet crude down 24 cents a barrel at $18.39. We'll keep you posted on all the market reaction throughout the day. I'm Terry Keenan at the New York Stock Exchange. CNN and Company is up next.
Russia's parliament building in flames, Boris Yeltsin's political opponents in retreat, and the country's future in question.
This is CNN and Company with Mary Tillotson.
Thanks for being with us. The constitutional crisis in Russia has turned bloody after Sunday riots by his political opponents. President Boris Yeltsin this morning sent tanks and troops to storm the parliament building, the White House, in downtown Moscow. That's where the dissidents had been holding up for 2 weeks. There have been reports, apparently from the dissidents themselves, that hundreds of people may have died in the assault on the parliament building. But military spokesman for Yeltsin called that a gross exaggeration. The building is now in flames. People have been fleeing the fire under white flags of surrender. And here to talk about the violence in Moscow are Russian scholar Katrina Vandenheuvel, Natalia Daryalova, a Russian journalist, and CNN's own Claire Shipman and Eileen O'Connor, who are joining us now from Moscow. Let's explain to our viewers, Claire and Eileen, that you are going to appear dark silhouettes to them on the screen. We do not want to put any lights on our two reporters in Moscow for fear that could make them targets. There have been tracers of some fire, some sniper fire in the city tonight. Starting with Claire, tell us what's going on right now. It's about 6:30 your time.
Well, right now, going down the street, we're being told by our crew to the side of the building there are tanks once again heading down Kutuzovsky Prospect toward the Parliament building. You can hear them, I think.
There were earlier, just a few moments ago, a lot of tracer fire over the rooftops here. Some coming out in our direction, which is why, as you pointed out, Mary, we're not turning on the lights because we don't want to be seen as perhaps we ourselves are gunned up here or let any government troops feel that we might be a threat. There was tracer fire along the rooftops. Clearly, there are some snipers along the buildings around the perimeter of the White House. We did see about an hour ago at least 100 people coming out of the front of the White House. We believe 2 of the people were Mr. Ruslan Hasbulatov and Mr. Rutskoy. They appeared to have been put into a separate bus that pulled up directly in front of the Russian White House to the front door entrance number 1. There were a lot of photographers around them. Flash bulbs went off. They were escorted by 2 tanks bearing the Russian flag as they went by. Some government troops, as they went by, fired into the air as if in victory.
But again, it is not clear that it was Mr. Hasbulatov or Mr. Rutskoy on the bus. That's how it appeared to us. It does appear that most of the people in the building also have surrendered. Again, we're not sure that they surrendered or whether they were taken prisoner. And again, there is new tank movement.
Claire, I'm going to interrupt you. The audio is in such bad shape. We're going to break away from you briefly. We're going to try and get that fixed. In the meantime, Katrina, there have been Western leaders from Bill Clinton to Mr. Major in Britain who have been coming to the support of Boris Yeltsin. What risk does that entail for them?
Mary, I think we need to ask, was it worth all of this? The bloodshed we see, the parliament in flames, not to wait for 18 months when regularly scheduled parliamentary elections were to be held.
What we see in Moscow today is not just a parliament in flames, but the entire fragile democratic process in flames. And I think Western governments, as they applaud Yeltsin's act, need to think about the long-term consequences of Yeltsin's dismantling of that very fragile democratic process. After all, he not only suspended Parliament, he suspended the Constitutional Court, he dismissed the Attorney General, he dismissed his own popularly elected Vice President, and they are now branded as criminals. Will opposition in Russia now be considered criminal?
To Natalia, there has been some pressure on Boris Yeltsin to immediately hold presidential elections as well as the parliamentary elections that he once held. Do you think the bloodshed in Moscow in the last 36, 48 hours is going to increase the pressure on him to hold elections for the presidency as well as the parliament?
Well, I think indeed, and it seems to me that the support from the Western leaders he received is well-deserved, because you see, democracy has to be strong. Democracy has to be able to protect itself. You see, several minutes ago, I spoke to various representatives of intelligentsia in Moscow, and many of them are extremely angry at the president that he allowed this to happen, because to them it is obvious that the parliament and those defendants of the White House who have organized it all are criminals. They are criminals. They have to be condemned as criminals. They are causing bloodshed, and democracy has to be able to protect itself.
So you say when the intellectuals you talk to are angry at Yeltsin, is it their opinion he did not move decisively and quickly enough? Is that their point?
Exactly. They are saying if on September 21st he said A, then on September 22nd he had to say B and had to arrest both Hasbulatov and Rudskoy because they were preparing for military activity in the open. They were distributing weapons. They say that even in the White House they have some missiles ready. This night, for instance, they have captured main Moscow customs and have distributed lists with the names of the most progressive leaders of democratic movement and of intelligentsia. In case they want to fly out of Moscow, they had to be stopped and arrested. So those are criminals.
We think we have our audio problems solved between here and Moscow. Claire, Eileen, we can see in the live shot we had from Moscow, where it is now early evening, what appears to be more gunfire going up into the air. What can you tell us?
That is apparently tracer fire coming from the directions of the International Hotel. It's around there. There were a lot of government troops around there earlier, firing out at snipers.
I heard your discussion earlier. I heard your discussion earlier with Gene Randall, and from what you said, there appear to be no targets. Is this a declaration to the world, we're still here and we're still armed? What do you make of it?
Well, there's a lot of small arms over in that direction because a lot of the defenders of the White House who had gone out on Sunday afternoon to do an attack on Russian television clearly would have come in, because of the way roads are blocked around the Russian White House, would have come in from that direction. And it had appeared from our vantage point, both up here and on the ground. Our cameraman Michael Johnson was filming earlier government troops firing rocket-propelled grenades at snipers in the International Hotel.
We're going to take
Right now we have live Siobhan Darrow inside the Kremlin with some comments from Boris Yeltsin's, the government side. Siobhan? We lost the signal, I'm sorry to say.
We will try and get back to both of you in Moscow and Siobhan Darrow with CNN, who's standing by in the Kremlin after we take a break. We'll be right back.
A new chapter has begun in Merrill Lynch's history in Asia. We are the first American securities firm invited to open an office in mainland China. Being there gives us a different perspective, which makes a difference for our clients. The difference is Merrill Lynch.
This is style.
Fashion's front row seat.
Elsa gets it all. Elsa is number one. She is the queen, the pioneer. I adore her.
The originator of fashion on television.
The heavy hitter is Style with Elsa Clench on CNN International. Elsa is style.
It's going to be different every week. The king of talk has come to weekends.
Take it away, Jay Leno.
We're going to try to be a little offbeat.
Oh, stop saying things about people.
And it's going to be more free-for-all.
Weights. Work out with weights. You turn down ballet, by the way.
God, I would go crazy if the show were politics only. Television will never be the same.
You be the judge.
Larry's working the weekend. Oh, come on, this beats work. Sunday on CNN International.
Gotta get out of here.
Welcome back. It has been a day of convulsive political events in Moscow. CNN's Siobhan Darrow is standing by in the Kremlin with some breaking news. Siobhan.
Mary, from inside the Kremlin, Boris Yeltsin has been closely monitoring the situation most of the day. Joining us now to discuss these latest developments, apparent capture of...
We have lost the signal again. I hope all of you understand it has been a terrifically difficult day to stay on the air as lengthily as we have. We will try and get Siobhan back. To Claire and Eileen, there was the suggestion by Christina, one of our guests, that one of the casualties today may have been democracy as we in the West like to define it. Is there any worry in Moscow that the reform movement has suffered a terrific blow today because of the violence? It would appear that we have trouble having Eileen and Claire join us as well. To Katrina, you raised the point earlier that Yeltsin may have found it necessary to take the steps he did to preserve his power, but now Russia at the moment is very much in his hands with no check or balance.
More ominously, Mary, Yeltsin has brought the military and security forces to the center stage of Russian political life. We haven't heard from the provinces either. Last week there was a report that more than half of the local legislatures had opposed Yeltsin's action and had called for the compromise of simultaneous elections. Our eyes have been trained on this one building in Moscow. Yeltsin has conquered that building, but how will he govern? I think many people in the West understand that Yeltsin may be a revolutionary leader or an anti-revolutionary leader, but that he has trouble governing. The problems Russia has faced for the last 2 years will not go away. Inflation, unemployment, the threat of separatism in the country. How will Yeltsin govern now that the situation is so polarized?
Eileen, we have you back with us. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry, Mary. It's very difficult to hear here because these tanks are rolling in down Kutuzovsky Prospect right below our bureau. But the point that the previous guest was making, I'm sorry, we didn't even catch names because it's so loud out here, is very, very true. This is going to be very difficult for Boris Yeltsin because of the regions. We have not heard from many of the local Soviets. We have heard from the former republics of the Soviet Union, Belarus, the Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. They have all thrown their support behind Boris Yeltsin. But in some of the regions last week, the regional leaders met in St. Petersburg, and they supported the Congress. The Congress was constantly pointing to that support. Those are the local regional Soviets. Many of them are former communists, and we have to also point out that those inside the building were not people who necessarily wanted a return, all of them, to the Soviet Union, and certainly not a return to communism per se. Many of them, their arguments, Mr. Rutskoy and Mr. Hasbulatov, concerned the pace of reform. They wanted a slower reform, one that was perhaps kinder and gentler to the people in this country. For life here has become far more difficult than many people here ever imagined.
Eileen, I'm going to interrupt only to say that the reporter Siobhan Darrow was trying to get on the air when we had audio problems, is that a spokesman for Russian President Boris Yeltsin now says that two of Yeltsin's toughest political opponents, Ruslan Khasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy, two of the parliamentarians who had been in the White House, are now in custody. That information from CNN Siobhan Darrow, speaking with the spokesman for Boris Yeltsin, who says that Ruslan Khasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy are now in custody by the Russian government, as headed by Boris Yeltsin. To Eileen, one of the guests, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, who you overheard as you came back in, has made the point that there is at least one school of thought that it was Boris Yeltsin that precipitated the violence. What sense do you have, Eileen, of who will be blamed for whatever the casualty figures are?
Well, certainly, I heard her point earlier that she felt that Boris Yeltsin should have taken decisive action far earlier in this crisis, perhaps on the 22nd of September. But that would have been very difficult. I mean, hindsight's 2020. That's ignoring the fact that it was not clear where the regions were going to throw their support, and certainly it did appear that they would throw their support behind the Congress. Certainly, Mr. Yeltsin has tried. There was a lot of restraint used by forces, Oman, Interior Ministry troops, during these anti-Yeltsin protests along the weekend. I was down on the ground in those protests. They were very ugly. Anti-Yeltsin demonstrators throwing rocks, Molotov cocktails at the troops. The troops did not fire back. They used rubber truncheons. They fired into the air, but they did not fire at the demonstrators. And therefore, Mr. Yeltsin was trying to not take any of the blame. As he said earlier in his statement, the blood of Russia was on the hands of those inside the White House. We have back Siobhan Darrow from within the Kremlin. Siobhan, can you hear me?
From inside the Kremlin, Boris Yeltsin has been monitoring the situation closely all day long now. Joining us is close Yeltsin aide Dmitry Rurikov to tell us a little bit more about the capture of Ruslan Hasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy and the so-called Russian defense minister. Could you tell us when this happened and how it came about?
Well, it happened very recently, about 1 hour, and they are being transported now to a seclusion place, where they will be secured from any interference.
And apparently there was some involvement of a Western embassy. Could you explain what that was all about?
Well, the people approached the Western embassy in order to secure guarantees from the Russian government that if they surrender, they will be protected, not attacked. And the guarantees were given. Maybe it was not the only channel of guarantees, but somehow the conditions were fulfilled by the Russian government.
And what exactly is going to happen now to Mr. Rutskoy and Mr. Hasbulatov?
Well, naturally they will be asked some questions, and there might be some investigations as to their deeds. Probably they'll face some legal procedure, which is only natural in cases like that.
Can you tell us where they're being kept?
Well, I would like to refrain from comments on that.
And which Western embassy was involved?
One of the European embassies.
Okay. We're hearing reports that more APCs and a tank are rolling down Kutuzovsky Prospect, one of Moscow's main roads, heading towards the White House. Do you know anything about that and why they might be doing that?
Well, I think the major White House business is almost over, but there are some trouble spots in the area, and there are people on the rooftops and maybe in other places too. So the situation remains rather tense, and shots are being heard from Kremlin.
There's fighting, we're told, just a few yards away from the White House near the Международное Hotel.
Yes, it was reported that one of the spots was Международное Hotel, and I think it lasted for a couple of hours or even 3 hours.
Are there going to be renegade forces loose throughout the city now for an extended period of time? How is this going to be dealt with?
Well, it is really a very complicated situation. It is very serious. It is risky, although it is not a serious challenge, but it has to be dealt with, and it is a complicated situation because, well, the security forces will do their best to protect human lives.
And what is Mr. Yeltsin doing at the moment? What's his next step? Is he going to address the nation again?
Probably he will address the nation maybe this evening or tomorrow, but right now he is having a conference with the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Security, the Minister of the Interior, the Secretary of the Security Council, and the Mayor of Moscow.
Okay, Mr. Dmitry Rurikov, close aide to Boris Yeltsin. I'm Siobhan Darrow, reporting live from inside the Kremlin. Mary?
Thanks very much, Siobhan. The headline out of that story, that Khasbulatov and Rutskoy, two prime political opponents of Boris Yeltsin, are in custody. No word about what charges, if any, will be lodged against them. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back.
Piacenza, Kashmir.
What began as a small, curious following became an international phenomenon. Now a bestseller, 1 million copies published worldwide in 17 languages. The Daily Mail calls it an inventive and idealistic adventure, a classic for all ages. The San Francisco Examiner says, fun, slightly mind-blowing science is the captivating thread.
Just when everything seems certain, when we know everything, all of a sudden we're faced with a place that changes all of our assumptions about humans and animals.
That place is Dinotopia, an uncharted island, a forgotten world where dinosaurs live peacefully alongside people. Join an explorer and his young son on their fascinating explorations into the unknown, in a world where wonders never cease. A book that has captivated the imaginations of readers all over the globe. Dinotopia. Look for it in bookstores everywhere.
Welcome back to our last couple of minutes. To Claire Shipman, Eileen O'Connor in Moscow. We've all talked about the fact that what goes on in Moscow may not augur for the situation out in the other republics. Right now, the military is in Boris Yeltsin's corner. Do you see any possibility that the next 24, 48 hours or however long that could change?
No, Mary, I don't. In fact, we were on the street today talking to a lot of the troops in the tanks. They just excluded that 100%. They are fully in support of Boris Yeltsin. They're not in support of necessarily having to do this action. Many said they wished it could have been solved without their help, but none of them mentioned any support for Alexander Rutskoy or for anybody other than Boris Yeltsin.
To Eileen, I know it's been a terribly taxing 12 hours or so since the assault on the Parliament building started for all of you who are covering it. Can you give us your prediction of what things are going to be like for the next 24 hours in Moscow?
Well, I think they're going to be still pretty tense because as we've seen, as we began this program, you saw sniper fire and tracer bullets coming from various buildings around the Russian White House. In the front, some of the charred remains of the building, the still smoldering bits of the building are coming off the front. It's not clear where all of the anti-Yeltsin, pro-Congress defenders of the White House are. Some of them are outside the perimeter in sniper positions. So I think the situation could be very tense, Mary.
And we're out of time. Thank you for joining us today, all of our guests, Natalia Daryavolova, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, and CNN's own Claire Shipman and Eileen O'Connor. Glad you could join us as well. I'm Mary Tillotson. CNN, of course, is going to continue covering the events in Moscow, and here's Bobby Batista with a look at what's ahead on NewsHour.
Mary, thanks. Russia's White House in flames. Surrender by the hardliners within. We'll have more live coverage of the political tumult in Moscow coming up. Also just ahead, despite new American casualties in Somalia, President Clinton says the U.S. must not waver from its commitment there. Plus opening statements in the World Trade Center bombing trial in New York. All that and more coming up next on NewsHour. Stay with us.
This is CNN.
Sind Sie auch über 50? Entschuldigen Sie die indiskrete Frage, aber ich bin selbst gerade 60 geworden. Da macht man sich natürlich so seine Gedanken über die Vorsorge im Alter und die Absicherung der Angehörigen, falls einem was passiert. Ja, und dann bin ich auf den 50-plus-Vorsorgeplan gestoßen. Eine Lebensversicherung nur für 50- bis 70-Jährige. Von Quelle Versicherungen. Denn Quelle hat hier die niedrigsten Beiträge. Schon mit 1 Mark am Tag sind Sie dabei. Anruf genügt. 0180 381 81 81. Dann kommt Ihr persönliches Angebot ganz einfach mit der Post. Und Sie werden garantiert aufgenommen, ohne Gesundheitsprüfung. Ich jedenfalls habe alles geregelt und das für nur 1 Mark am Tag. Machen Sie es doch wie ich. Rufen Sie einfach an.
Lets you get away from the simplification. And the more talk shows you have, the more detail you can add to the picture.
Hundreds of Boris Yeltsin's opponents leave Russia's White House and surrender to President Yeltsin's troops.
This surrender follows a day-long assault on the White House by troops and tanks loyal to Russia's president. Welcome to our continuing coverage of the situation in Moscow. I'm Reed Collins in Washington.
And I'm Bobby Batista at CNN Center in Atlanta. Russian President Boris Yeltsin appears to have won the latest test of wills with his hardline opponents. Hundreds of people have left Russia's parliament building and surrendered to President Yeltsin's troops. It is believed that leaders of the revolt against Mr. Yeltsin, Parliament Chairman Ruslan Khasbulatov and Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, were among those who surrendered. Khasbulatov and Rutskoy may have been put on one of the buses that took prisoners away, although we have not confirmed that as yet. Groups of people left the White House after a final heavy barrage of gunfire raked the building. Tank shells blasted holes in the 19-story structure, starting fires that are still raging at this hour. Several bodies have been removed from the Parliament building. There is no casualty count, but a military aide to Boris Yeltsin said as many as 500 people may have been killed in the Russian White House. And it is possible the violence has not ended. After the mass surrender, random gunfire erupted from another building in the neighborhood. CNN's Gene Randall is standing by now in Moscow with the latest. Gene?
It is after nightfall here in the Russian capital. Boris Yeltsin's idea was to wrap up the operation against the Russian parliament building by dusk. For the most part, he seems to have done that, although we cannot confirm that everyone is out of that building. You can see it is fairly well engulfed in flames, the result of 125-millimeter cannon shots from T-80 tanks on the bridge just across from the Russian White House. The surrender began early this evening, Moscow time, as hundreds of people streamed out of the building. We heard first that Ruslan Khasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy, the hardline major adversaries of Boris Yeltsin, were demanding a condition for their surrender, and that is that they be guaranteed safety by Western embassies. And now we have heard just moments ago from an aide to Boris Yeltsin, Dmitry Rurikov, that in fact those guarantees were given to a Western embassy, and that Khasbulatov and Rutskoy now are in custody of government forces.
Gene, where would they be in custody at this time?
Well, he was very non-specific about that. All he said was that they were in a safe location and that the Russian government had given assurances to a European embassy. That's all they would say about the embassy, a European embassy, that they would be safe. But in fact, in recent days, Boris Yeltsin has referred to these two men as criminals, insisting they would have to take responsibility for the bloodshed, not just for the bloodshed last night at the Russian Central TV, but also the bloodshed which claimed the lives of two Russian policemen and an elderly woman during the course of the political stalemate before the violence broke out last night and today.
Gene, they may have gotten guarantees on their safety or their lives, but is it likely they will go to trial then and be tried as criminals?
Well, Boris Yeltsin has certainly indicated that is his intention. That will be part of his very delicate political balancing act as we see how he treats the vanquished in the situation, because clearly the parliament forces are the vanquished here. Boris Yeltsin is on his way to being the clear winner, but it remains to be seen just how he treats the political situation after this. If he had his wish, those two men would certainly go to trial. He has called what's happened here. Okay, I understand we do have now the part of the interview from Dmitry Rurikov inside the Kremlin just a few moments ago.
And they are being transported now to a seclusion place, where they will be secured from any interference.
And apparently there was some involvement of a Western embassy. Could you explain what that was all about?
Well, the people approached the Western embassy in order to secure guarantees from Russian government that if they surrender, they will be protected, not attacked. And the guarantees were given. Maybe it was not the only channel of guarantees, but somehow the conditions were fulfilled by the Russian government.
And what exactly is going to happen now to Mr. Rutskoy and Mr. Khasbulatov?
Well, naturally they will be asked some questions, and there might be some investigations as to their deeds. And probably they'll face some legal procedure, which is only that.
Back now to our live picture in Moscow. This is the backside of the Russian Parliament building. The building itself engulfed in flames in its middle section. These are armored personnel carriers which have just rolled in, part now of the security cordon around the Russian Parliament building. But for the most part, the situation here is quiet, although there has been sporadic gunfire, not from the building itself, but in the surrounding areas. But for the moment, at least, that gunfire has died down. And that's the situation here.
Well, Gene, it seems, as you say, very quiet at this time, but in the overall picture, Mr. Yeltsin has been putting out small fires, if you will, with his hardline opponents for some time. Does this necessarily mean that the insurrection is over just because the situation has been neutralized at the White House?
Well, it means the immediate situation is over. It does not mean Mr. Yeltsin's political problems are over. And once again, he will have to tread a very fine, delicate line once this immediate crisis is over. He still has the matter of elections coming up. He still has the matter of support and lack of support in the outlying regions and autonomous republics of Russia. So this was the immediate situation. He saw that he had to take the risk, political risk, of ending this White House occupation quickly. He, for the most part, has done that, but his work is far from over.
All right, Gene Randall in Moscow. We'll be back with you. Thank you. Reed?
Today's assault on the Russian White House didn't come without warning. After the violence had flared in Moscow streets yesterday, Mr. Yeltsin went to state television to accuse his opponents of launching a coup.
This armed rebellion is doomed to restore peace, law and order, and calm troops are being pulled in Moscow. Their objective is to liberate the premises that have been seized by the criminal elements, to disarm the illegal armed formations.
Mr. Yeltsin's appearance followed a pitched battle for control of Russia's main television center. For a time, control of that building seemed divided and the station went off the air. Flashpoint of the crisis that started last month with Mr. Yeltsin disbanding the parliament came about midday yesterday, day 13 of the political crisis. Thousands of anti-Yeltsin demonstrators clashed with government troops near the parliament building. For several hours, it appeared that anti-Yeltsin forces had the upper hand. The opposition leader, Alexander Rutskoy, urged his followers to storm the television station, seize the city's government headquarters. And at one point, the hardliners marched around outside the city hall, showing off this set of keys, apparently captured in a raid on the mayor's office. The government forces retook the mayor's office, though, around midnight, hours before Mr. Yeltsin's forces launched the dawn attack on the White House itself. Well, President Clinton is in San Francisco, where he's getting regular updates on the situation in Moscow. Though he repeatedly expressed his support for Mr. Yeltsin yesterday, aides say he has no plans to call the Russian president. More on the U.S. reaction to all of this, we'll go to CNN's World Affairs correspondent Ralph Begleiter at the State Department. Ralph.
Reed, like almost everyone else here in Washington, officials here at the State Department are watching CNN's live reports from Moscow and making snap judgments about how to respond. Even inside the Russian embassy here in Washington, officials are watching CNN 24 hours a day, trying to stay abreast of developments in their own capital. Clinton administration officials, in effect, gave Boris Yeltsin a green light to use whatever force he deemed necessary to bring the political conflict in Moscow to an end. Senior U.S. officials say Yeltsin informed Washington before today's assault on the Russian White House that he was bringing in Spetsnaz troops, highly trained forces, which could only mean an assault of some sort was anticipated. Top U.S. officials said before the assault that the Clinton administration assumed there would be violence. It was unrealistic, in the words of one U.S. official, to think otherwise. It's something of a risky policy for President Clinton. He's indirectly supporting the use of force. And that could turn out to be embarrassing if today's assault turns out to have a heavy toll. But it's also the policy U.S. officials believe is most likely to promote democracy in Russia in the long run. Administration officials support their decision to back Yeltsin by repeatedly pointing out that he, not the rebel parliamentarians of the Russian White House, was elected, supported twice in democratic ballots by the Russian people. Some Russian diplomats here in Washington are even speculating that now, after the assault, Yeltsin may speed up plans for the parliamentary elections he announced 2 weeks ago. Why wait until December? One Russian diplomat asks rhetorically. He suggests Yeltsin might quickly regain any loss of confidence around the world by accelerating the timetable for elections to take the edge off his use of force in Moscow. Reed?
Ralph, as we speak, Dee Myers, the presidential spokesman, is saying the Democratic governments have to defend themselves against the use of force. And again, Mr. Clinton standing four square, as they put it, behind Mr. Yeltsin. But let me ask you what sort of contacts there have been between the White House and Mr. Yeltsin.
The administration here in the U.S. has kept a sort of arm's-length relationship with Mr. Yeltsin throughout this confrontation. From what we understand, the contacts with Mr. Yeltsin's staff have been through U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pickering in Moscow and then through Strobe Talbot, the administration's top representative to the former Soviet republics, including Russia. President Clinton has not spoken with Mr. Yeltsin. Secretary of State Warren Christopher has not spoken with Andrei Kozyrev, the foreign minister of Russia. The contacts have been conducted at a lower level.
All right, thank you, Ralph Begleiter, live at the State Department. Bobby?
And we'll have more on the situation in Moscow right after this break. Stay with us.
When you need the power of an upright in the palm of your hand, reach for the Dirt Devil Handy. Its extra long lead takes it everywhere, and its revolving brush hunts down dirt, with attachments available for those awkward nooks and crannies. It's so light, cleaning stairs is a breeze. And as for pet hairs...
And the deal was apparently brokered with the aid of 3 European countries, European embassies. We don't know any more details about that, but we do know that they will be tried, that the deal was basically that they could be taken safely, that they would be taken in unharmed. Boris Yeltsin, we know, is now in his Kremlin office meeting with top advisors. He's been in the Kremlin all night long and most of the morning. He did leave in the afternoon for a couple of hours. He left by helicopter, presumably to his country home for rest after being up all night. We're told that he perhaps will address the nation again tonight or perhaps sometime tomorrow. He is closely monitoring the situation.
Surrender to Yeltsin's troops. It is believed that Rutskoy, the Russian vice president, and Khasbulatov, the chairman of the parliament, were taken away on buses with the other prisoners. Yeltsin's opponents left the White House after a final heavy barrage of gunfire raked the building. Tank shells had blasted holes in the 19th-story structure, starting fires that are still burning out of control. Several bodies were removed from the Parliament building, too. There has been no firm count of the casualties. At one point, a Yeltsin aide was quoting those inside as saying that 500 might have been killed. Later, though, the government said that estimate simply was too high. After the mass surrender, random gunfire erupted from another building in the general neighborhood. The barrage didn't appear to be directed at any particular target. Some rounds did strike a cupola atop an building.
Joining us now from Moscow is CNN's Gene Randall. Gene, can you bring us up to date on the latest?
Hillary, on the political front, we can tell you that we have heard from the European community that it has received assurances from Russian President Boris Yeltsin for the safety of Ruslan Khasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy, who earlier today had laid that down as a condition of their surrender to government troops, that they wanted to be assured of their personal safety. Now those assurances have gone to the European community. However, we don't know where Khasbulatov and Rutskoy are being held. Their surrender climaxed a long day here in Moscow, a day which is not over by any means. There was a large-scale government assault against the Russian Parliament building. That defiant parliament had stayed holed up there since Boris Yeltsin tried to dissolve the body on September 21st. Yeltsin decided today was the day for action. It followed by just hours of bloody battle at the Russian Central Television facility on Sunday night, and we are now told the death toll in that night of fighting could top 60. We don't know about the death toll at the Parliament building. Earlier today, one government official said he thought the toll might be 500, but later he corrected himself, and the clarification was that the information was based on a faulty report from someone on the Parliament side, so we don't know the death toll there. What's been happening